Good morning, everybody. We'll call our meeting to order. It's a good afternoon yesterday. A lot was covered, a lot was accomplished. Thank you for breakfast this morning, Petra. It's great. We renewed all of our energy. So we have a lot to cover this morning, and I guess, John, you're first up.
Okay, pledge allegiance on here. You don't want to do that, Mayor?
I'm sorry?
You don't want to pledge allegiance again?
So if you look at your agendas, we're going to make a couple of changes to it, but it's really just for efficiency of flow. We're going to cover off the public works session first. Yesterday we talked about the addition of a staff person to, take some of the pressure off of the contracts that we have or some of the needs that we have that aren't necessarily directly covered by that. But today, it's much more of a pragmatic view of things. Most notably, how do we maybe deal once and for all with the Sorrel Railroad property and the fact that that's just a burdensome area for the town to maintain properly. So with that, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. We'll go through that, and we're not necessarily going to solve the problem here today. We're just going to talk about some opportunities to maybe address the circumstance, and maybe just at the end of the process, think about how we would clean up that Sorrel Rail operation. Okay? All right?
Thank you, Mr. Moffitt. Right, so getting right into it, we'll talk about this Sorrel Rail site that we've got going on. So like we mentioned yesterday, the health, safety, and welfare of the island and its residents is a responsibility of the town. This is why the town currently has a contract in place with Carolina Waste to perform residential and commercial services for household trash, recycling, and yard debris on the island. To date, the town has been borrowing land on Kestrel Court, which we all know is off of Sorrel Rail, for a secondary option for residents to properly dispose of extra solid waste. Some challenges that we've had at this site. Improper use of this site has been an ongoing issue. However, improper use of the site has been an ongoing issue. However, in the past year, we've seen a spike in the misuse and irresponsible behavior taking place at the site. Initially, this year, we thought that because there was a drastic increase of online ordering due to the pandemic, that led to obviously a drastic increase in cardboard specifically that's making its way over to this site. And once these compactors get filled, though we have rules and regulations on the signs, it's a lot easier to just leave stuff on the ground, especially after the first person does it. Then everybody, all the subsequent visitors think that that's okay. That was a big issue at the beginning of the pandemic, but since it's been happening throughout this entire year, it's kind of led town staff to believe that the island has just simply outgrown this site. So in an effort to mitigate these issues, the town, we've issued fines, upgraded the signage, upgraded the security cameras, but unfortunately we're still continuing to see improper use of this site. Town staff, we've now decided to kind of explore the idea of closing the current facility on Kestrel Court and moving that facility over to the municipal complex. So this is a bird's eye of the complex. Where the red square is kind of the general area where we would be looking to put a new facility. So right in between the garage and the pond in the back over there. So how would this help solve some of our problems at the Sorrel Rail site? Moving it to the municipal complex, we could increase the capacity, add more containers and opportunities for people to properly dispose of their solid waste. Right now we have limited space because we're just borrowing that land. We can control the vehicular flow in and out of the site. Right now, believe it or not, there are ways for people to enter into this site without their tags ever showing up on cameras, so I can't necessarily look back and find out who is using the site improperly. But if we design it, then we can control that. Better camera system and better accessibility for monitoring. Being right here on the site, you like to think that people wouldn't misuse the site right in front of the municipal center. Like to hope, but we're also right here. We're also right here to be able to closely monitor that. So a timeline, I've got some updated things that aren't on this. We've been working with the architect to kind of get some foundation on this. So, right, we have an ambitious goal of this kind of being operable for the golf tournament, and that is going to be kind of in the hands of the county. There's two different ways the county can look at this. So the architect believes that because if we can keep this under a half an acre of land disturbance, then we can get away with calling this or just a notification process for the county. His fear, though, is the county might construe this as part of a larger common plan, in which case the permitting process could take around 4 months. And that's just the permitting process. So if the county wants to take this approach, we can try to work with them and sway them into hopefully just being a notification process. Also with the architect, I had a phone call with him the other day, earlier this week, and he and I both were kind of in the ballpark of hoping that this is going to be about $400,000 project. He doesn't see that it would be more.
How much?
400,000. Yeah, so right now he's still in the process of getting what the fees and everything from Carolina Waste would look like. And once he gets that information, then he's going to send that over to us. So that's an option that we're looking at to mitigate the soil rail project.
So a couple of questions on the, if you did the project here, what is the length of time? If today is the start date, what is the length of time? It's gonna vary by as much as 4 months based on the permitting. How quickly would it be operational here?
That's a good question, and without having the design yet, we don't have the full design yet, so kind of unknown at this point. He's still working on designing the actual facility.
So it could be easily 6 to 10 months from today to get completely done?
Including the 4-month permitting process.
Yeah.
Potentially.
So in the meantime, what do we do with the Sorrel Rail site?
Continue to monitor. I've one more time upgraded the signage there. Because the signs do say if this place is full, there's 2 other options. Well, 3 other options. There's Beach Walker Drive at the Keek Administration Building. There's here, and then there's the Bees Ferry landfill. So we've really done everything. There's a 4-foot by 4-foot sign there with all of these directions on it.
So do we have the same issue of people putting debris in the wrong places and the wrong debris at the Kika site, or does it stay pretty clean?
For the most part, it stays pretty clean. Maybe we've never gotten phone calls about that being an issue, and I just think because it doesn't get used as much, I like to speculate that people will show up to Sorrel Rail, and that's where it's gonna end up no matter what. You make one trip with garbage, and that's where it's gonna be. Mr. Parker.
So if the underlying problem is that the island has gotten too big for current facilities, this new facility, will it have more compactors, more dumpsters, and by what magnitude will it have?
That's something that we're working with the architect to figure out how big this area is gonna be, and then that's gonna kind of dictate how much capacity. It'll be more capacity than what's at Sorrel Rail right now. Promise you that. And then we also kind of might. Well, yeah, it'll be more capacity than what's at Sorrel Rail.
So how often does Sorrel Rail, the dumpsters there get picked up by the Carolina Waste Place?
The big roll-off dumpster, the big recycle dumpster, that gets serviced, it's 3 times a week. And then the cardboard and household trash compactors get 4, I believe. I could look at that again. But again, what we've seen is not a lack of service. I've been there on multiple occasions where these compactors and dumpsters have been empty or had plenty of room left in there when there's still stuff on the ground. So I don't think it's right, it's I don't think it's a matter of how many times this gets serviced. They aren't maxing out before people are starting to put litter on the ground.
So if we made a decision that we were gonna do this, could we close the sewer rail facility before it became operational and force people to go to either Kika or here or the dump?
Technically, we could,
I wouldn't do that.
I guess, but I don't know.
I would not
Were you-
I'm not suggesting we do
Yeah.
Right, I mean,
I'd still just pile it on the ground.
Yeah,
Well,
and Kika
'cause-
may say to us, remove those,
It's gonna be there.
yeah, Kika may say to us, remove those.
right, I mean,
dumpsters."
technically, we
It's a
could
problem.
close it and not give an alternate option, but we don't like that, you
No,
know.
that's not a good plan.
it's not.
I'm asking.
But yes, sir.
Brian, I'm sure your architect knows this, but I've been to some sites in North Carolina. You can't mess up the site, and it's because of how they've designed it. There are drive-through lanes with fences on them, where this says, you know, this is the drive-through for cardboard. So you stop your car in the lane, and the cardboard disposer is right there. There's no place to put it other than in the thing.
Mhm.
And people don't, and then you go to the next lane and it says household trash. Now, you don't have to go to that one, but if you have that, that's where you go next. They've designed it such that you can't make a mess out of it. That's what the architect needs to focus on, is the design. Because if you look at Sora Rail, first of all, it's kind of a backwater spot, so people think, well, I can trash this. Secondly,
Exactly.
it's set up so you can trash it. If we design it correctly, we can eliminate all of those problems. And people
I
drive
agree.
in and drive out, they never have to back up, which they also like.
Yeah,
The design becomes very.
York County does a good job with the way they've designed their, sites that are not at the dump, the neighborhood sites, if you will.
Mhm.
Not quite that sophisticated, but close. And, of course, theirs are also manned, which I don't think we wanna get into having some.
These are unmanned and
Yeah.
want to run into.
Right. The goal would to not need anything like that. But again, maybe not manning it, but obviously monitoring it and being right in our backyard, we could step out the door and go take a look.
So going back to our discussion yesterday on the money, how would we pay for something like this that's $400,000?
So we would pay from the reserves, and because it's mostly, sounds like this project mostly benefits residents, not tourists, it would be, majority of that would come from the general fund. However, I was thinking about it last night, and the tourist money also could be spent on beautification of the island, and that would enhance the looks, because right now, driving by that site, it's just really crappy. So we can probably, what we normally do, we justify that projects like the road, for example, 80% is for tourism, 20% is for residents. So maybe we could do reverse, 20% for tourism and 80% for residents, because the main function would be to, help residents, but it would come from the reserves.
Since a lot of these people are renters that use that site, is that counted as a
That's-
tourist?
I think that would be like 20%.
That's
Yeah.
how I feel, that even though, a lot of them do, but, the main function is for the residents. So 20% would be for, we can justify and use from the restricted funds.
The other thing that this would help is, one thing Brian and I talked about is how much of the waste that gets deposited there is actually construction waste
I know.
that, the contractors are supposed to take with them, and they don't, they just leave it there, particularly if it's small amounts, but, several small amounts becomes a large amount in not too long a period of time.
That's exactly right. And there's a lot of contractors on this island that don't have decals or insignia on their vehicles. So again, difficult to determine who that is. And a contractor can show up and fill up these containers in one run. And then we've got residents that are left with no other option.
Right.
Well,
Brian?
no other option there.
Brian, what role does Carolina Waste play in this? Are those dumpsters, do we lease them? Do we own them? And if we change location, do they have any say in what we do?
No, we would be allowed to relocate those. Yes, sir. So right now, the big recycle roll off, that's what they're calling permanent, and basically we rent that. But the two compactors, we just pay a weekly fee.
So we pay fee. Do they have larger, or do they have different sizes of those compact?
They do.
Smaller and larger?
They do.
So as part of the design, that can be taken into account, capacities and the like.
It might involve some renegotiation on Carolina Waste's contract for pickup and so forth, because it might be different here than what's existing at Soil Rail.
It could be. So, pretty sure that we're getting some good rates with Carolina Waste right now. I think the contractor's more or less copied and pasted and signed over, and I think it was an oversight because we've done some research and their rates are a lot higher in other areas. So it'll be interesting to see what we get back for the service on these.
So I guess the question in front of us today is, you know, I dare say that we all are not satisfied with the Soil Rail site. What is the sense of pursuing this, putting it on this property?
I think you have to. Soil Rail's never going to be successful. You'd be fighting this forever.
I think it's an excellent idea. I have been to Soar Rail, I've called Brian, there is not enough room there to do this adequately. And I think by having it in a place where it is going to get, people are going to feel like they're being monitored if you're just driving through back here, will make it 100% better. And, this enforcement issue that Brian has referred to with the cameras, he's done a tremendous job with that, but it's still, you could spend the whole week doing enforcement.
Right. So there is a point where you can't actually force compliance anymore than
Right.
you're doing without putting somebody there. And,
That's right.
And I think we've reached that point. I don't know what else.
I believe so. Well, and the good thing too is a lot of this, all of the misuse, it happens during the daytime. There's no one that goes there, at 3 o'clock in the morning. So again, pretty risky to drive through our facilities, through town hall, make a mess while everyone's here, and then leave the site. Like y'all alluded to, that the Soar Rail site is asking for non-compliance.
The other thing is, it used to be, this happened just at holiday time, when we had many more visitors. That is not the case anymore, it's happening on a regular basis.
That's correct.
Yeah. So we will pursue this,
Move forward.
at least to the point where we get a better handle on what the cost would be, and then we can make a better decision.
Absolutely. I think.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't-
I think that it's a disaster, and it's to Dan's point about being a backwater. My wife has told me before, it's the only place on this island she doesn't feel safe, and she doesn't go there anymore. She goes down to Kiko.
Yeah, that's always wide open and easy to get to.
Well, it's the type of thing, something bad's gonna happen,
Right.
something bad's gonna happen. I'll be interested to see the detail of the cost estimate. Is the architect, are they even envisioning a common pad, like a concrete pad for the entire area? Is it still gonna be?
Yes, I believe that's kind of what we've talked about is a slab with
slab.
some type of, curb cut into the area. It should be pretty minimal.
So probably the cost, you have to probably put power out there, water,
Hmm.
electricity, all that stuff.
Yes,
So
sir.
we're gonna be making an investment in the infrastructure surrounding it, I presume we either move what we have or we get new ones, different sizes, but other than the slab, it's gonna be a lot of the other stuff that's just gonna have to support itself.
Yes, sir.
No, I think it might work out. Then at least be something that's done.
Exactly.
It's done for the longer term.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I'm getting back to time frames then. In terms of the budget timeline that Deruta went out, presented to us yesterday, what do you think? When are they gonna get back with us with something, or will you have something to put into this year? Are you thinking of this year or charging it again? Are you thinking of the new budget, 21-22, or are you thinking of the 20-21 budget?
Ideally, this one, because again, we would like for this timeline, ambitiously, if we had it our way, it would be before the golf tournament.
Okay.
So, but you know, I've got some contact to make with the county, and again, see what they're gonna call this, and that will kind of determine the timeline after that. If they're gonna call this part of a larger common plan, then it'll go into the next budget.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so John's going to lead the next part of the discussion, and you can see on this chart the topics that he's got. What I'd like to do is kind of close off each one as we go. So rather than let him finish his whole thing and go back, we'll cover off the HR&A study and then the annexation. That ought to be a short discussion. In fact, when Stephanie and I were talking about what to talk about annexation, she said, you know, it's not a prolonged discussion. It's really just what are the kind of the points we need to think about. We're not actively annexing anything at the moment. We don't have any active plans, so we'll talk about that, and then go through the other topics. The planning commission and some zoning issues is a big part of what John's going to talk about. But let's close off each one as we go, and that way I think we'd be most efficient of our time. All right, John?
I just wanted to start, before we get into HR study and annexation planning, just a really quick sort of review of planning and zoning. I think for the most part, a lot of people ask, well, what does a planner kind of do? And so the easiest part is to split it in these two buckets. And so the day-to-day or short-term, it's really the zoning administration and the review of permits, where subdivision, all of those things, and then long-range, more focusing on the comp plan. So the HR study, that kind of falls in the long-range planning, along with the development agreements and a lot of the other nuances of thinking beyond sort of just today. In going to the HRA study, as Mr. Moffitt mentioning, there's sort of three things that, from a planning standpoint, I thought that was important for the town to focus on and prioritize in the next several years. The first one being sort of this era of redevelopment. I struggled calling this redevelopment because it's already happened. But the next phase of what Kiowa looks like, as we know, within the next few years, we'll have no more new developed properties. That would include Ocean Park, which pretty much is mostly subdivided already. And then when it comes to the western end of the island, we know what Beach Walker, Parcel 13, Captain Sam's, those are really the remaining sort of large entitlements when it pertains to development agreement. And so the HR study, one of the main things that came out of that study was, well, what's next? How do we encourage or continue to allow residents to reinvest into properties? And so the redevelopment era, I think, is an overarching theme in the housing study of how we monitor or encourage residents to reinvest into older properties. This has been done kind of as an example of what the resort has done. We know the West Beach efforts. When you talk to Kiel residents, the most important thing, everyone always referenced the good old days of being able to drive on the beach and those type nuances of at the old inn and whatnot. But as the resort has sort of marketed, rebranded it to Kiowa 2.0, all the upgrades, the conference center, relocating everything from East Beach. Those are things that were thought of previously, and now sort of the town sort of should take that same approach and think about what's next. When it comes to the HRA study, I'm going to jump around. I got some slides to kind of flip through. I think it'll be good to just review the report itself. I'm not sure if everyone's had a chance to really review in detail the housing study that was completed. But from a planning standpoint, one of the important pieces of this is fusing this into our comprehensive plan. And I'll talk about that update in a few moments. But being able to take what's from this study, the biggest thing is looking at demographic changes on the island, looking at the proposals of which properties are sort of outdated, older, what can be done from a zoning standpoint, what can be done internally that would adjust the ease or make it a little bit more incentivized for people to reinvest. The struggle is, or the challenges rather, with that is that we know a lot of the multifamily units on Kiowa are pretty much the ones that have been they're outdated, if you will, and those have challenges of being able to get collective membership to agree to make those substantial improvements. And so I think the town, we ought to find a way to be able to study that a little bit deeper and see how can that be done, whether it's incentivizing, relaxing some of development standards, working with the ARB to see what can be done when it comes to a lot of the older 80s, early 90 properties. I don't know if you wanted to stop there and
So if you've not read all of this, I would encourage you to read it all. But if you want to take a shortcut, pages 35 through 38 are the pages where they say, here's what we think you need to do, and it's an extensive list. So one of the things that Stephanie and I talked about last week was when we did this study, we had this group of people together, and we communicated with the community and all these other groups to help put this together. Then maybe what we ought to do is to reconstitute a group that now takes these recommendations and actually puts a plan together that says, over the next year, 3 years, 5 years, here are the things that we're actually going to do so that we can get them in the budget, we can get somebody assigned to them in terms of responsibility. Because what I'm concerned about is if we don't do something definitive like that, that the next time John does a presentation, it'll look very similar to what he's doing today, and we will not have really accomplished anything. And so to get some good results, I think we need to have a group that actually is responsible for coming up with a development plan, if you will, different than a development agreement, but just a plan of action to address some of these. There's some of these that we can't address, and we can't force one of the regimes to redo the architectural elements of their condos. But there are a lot of things in this list that we can do. So that's kind of the approach I like to take.
Otherwise, I agree. Otherwise, you're right, nothing will happen. It isn't urgent.
Well, and you say it's not urgent. A lot of it is maybe not urgent and that it needs to be done immediately. But a lot of these things are urgent if you put it in the context of the fact that over the next, let's just say, 5 to 8 years, the developer's going to be gone. Now, I don't say we become the developer, but we become the party that is responsible for continued development of the island's facing activity to the public. So that's kind of my feeling on that, is that we ought to have a defined group that's responsible for coming up with a plan of what things we want to do, and let's just say this year, 3 years, and 5 years.
I'm not even certain that it has anything to do with the developer per se. I think it's just a matter, I think it's just a matter of time. These projects that we're talking about, it's just they're older. And some entity needs to become the catalyst for encouraging monies to be put into these assets so that the owners, whether they're individual owners, a regime or whatever, proceed and try to improve on what their holdings are. So I think it's just a logical extension of what a town would do. We would be the catalyst. We're going to try to encourage these things to take place. The association, I'm not certain that the association per se would be the catalyst. They're going to be the recipient. Once something is done, more people move in, whatever, then it benefits them. But some entity has to try to encourage this to take place, and I think that should be the town.
And there are some things in here that if you
how to do it, or they're not gonna have a clue.
That's
They're
right.
not studying this problem.
And so I think that, you know, again, I've read these 6 pages or so, I don't know, a dozen times, and it's overwhelming when you read them, of the things that they're suggesting we do. But we don't need to do them all today. We need to pick the ones that are, you know, kind of biggest bang for the buck, or things that need to be done sooner than others for infrastructure preservation reasons, or whatever the reason is. So that's what I would propose, is that we put together basically a working group that says, here's what we do, and it needs to have some representation, I think, from council, and I guess I would be a likely choice.
Absolutely.
But then we also need.
Raise your hand and stand up.
We need, you know, obviously, you know, staff representation, because they have the wherewithal to tell us whether we're doing things correctly or not. You know, perhaps we actively involve somebody from the ARB. So that
I
they
think-
have to, so that they become invested in this process.
I think they're critical, and yes, I think they're critical. I also think that they need, in doing that, there needs to be a critical assessment in terms of the standards that they've created that can really act as deterrents for this willingness to renovate, as Scott was saying, and really to critically look at, you know, is that really what we want to do? Do you really want to just say no to people that they can't do these types of things, or make it so prohibitive? I mean, because I can see why we're all homeowners in one sense or another. You just see somebody just saying the heck with it and just move on, just put it off for another year.
That's what they do. If they don't get the answer they want, they just put it for sale and
They're out of there.
Well, and some of the things in this list of tasks involve redevelopment of older structures.
Sure.
Not just the regime properties, but the individual homes, and that's why I think that ARB ought to be invested in this process. And they may say they don't want to participate, but.
But the ARB, remember, was controlled completely by the partners.
Well, and that's why you have to.
You gotta go to those guys.
You have to go to them,
That's-
and certainly they ought to have representation on it.
Well, in the case though, given the long-range nature that John is referring to here, because if our partner is gonna really be emotionally invested in 5 years?
Less and less each year.
Yeah, exactly, that's what I'm saying, so.
But you gotta get to those guys now and say, we need some changes here.
But if you go to them, let's just take that, if you went to them and said, we're gonna put this working committee together, and we would like representation from the partners, we would like it in the form of the ARB, because that's really the practical component that we're interested in dealing with. There's also a thing in the development agreement that talks about what happens when the partners get to a particular point with the ARB. And I don't know that we need to solve that problem today, but my opinion is that if we put a working committee together, the ARB, the partners ought to be involved, but I would suggest that it's in the form of an ARB representative.
Well, I agree, John, but I think, as Dan said, I think part of it, the underpinning of it, is the control of the ARB. And maybe like everything else, now's the time to really address that. Because
That's right.
the interest that the developers have had with the ARB represents the entire history of the evolution of Kiowa to date, quite frankly. This is a whole nother thing. I'm not certain that the developers really care, honestly, about what's taking place in a particular section of the island in terms of getting homeowners to reinvest in their property. That's not part of that can't be on their radar screen. I can't imagine that.
And I guess that's my point. I don't know that trying to resolve the what happens to the ARB question is part of this.
Well, maybe just in a different venue, but I think the control of the ARB is going to come up sooner rather than later.
I thought that was planned to be turned over within the last 3 years. The ARB.
So in the development agreement, it basically says that at some point,
Right.
it's very non-specific, that the ARB will be turned over to KICA. That's what it says in the development
Yes,
agreement.
that's what I was,
But it doesn't specify that, when you're 90% sold out
No.
or built out, there's no, it's not specific on when that occurs.
But I think Kika said they weren't ready for it.
Well, I don't know, but I think that goes to what John said, is that even the right place?
Right, I agree.
And then you got this whole public-private thing, there's a whole bunch of issues around what happens with the ARP. But I guess my concern is that I don't wanna get involved in the political swamp of what happens to ARB, when what we're trying to do is we're trying to put together an action plan that says, let's address these issues.
You're absolutely correct, and you shouldn't. You're absolutely correct. What you've outlined, I think, is the approach to take.
Okay, so how about if we do this with this HRNA study? First off, let's rename it so it's easier to say. But maybe I'll get with Stephanie and with John to put together what we think is a team that would work.
Yeah, and we also, and part of the things that you guys were discussing is that we have a core group, and then understanding if there's a role still for that core group.
Right.
And the core group was made up of Kiwa Partners, Kika, and the resort. So it could be that you may meet with the core group and they then assign individuals to work on the working group so we can get together and talk, so.
So
The
John
other
and
part-
Stephanie and I'll get,
Pardon me?
we'll get that put together and come back to council and say, here's what we're proposing. And
Wonderful.
everybody get a nod on that one and we'll move forward.
Wonderful, John. Great.
Yeah, the other part I would add is part of this, well, a lot of the work for the housing element within the comp plan, this report pretty much completes, and so a lot of that we can pull in it. So the few members of the planning commission who would entail could be a part of that process as well.
Okay.
Are we good on this one? Okay. The second sort of element has been this beyond the gates. That's kind of the theme I've titled it. We've had a lot of discussion about this yesterday, morely on Johns Island roads. If you recall, in December when I did the presentation on the different alternatives for Bohicket and Main Road, one of the things that has come out of that is we realize the pressures that are now, growth is happening in the region at a fast rate. And so from a Kiowa community standpoint, I feel that the Kiowa community can no longer afford to just sort of isolate itself and not pay attention more closely to what's happening on Johns Island in the region because of those development pressures. What we know happens on Johns Island, we've looked closely at the roads. I think that's the #1 impact. But what happens about developments, conservation, all of those different land use types are going to have an impact on Kiowa sooner than later. And so what role does the town begin to play in engaging with others beyond just the ARB, beyond just the partners, beyond just the resort? So this leads into the conversations of annexation planning. And to Mr. Moffitt's point, this is not the town aggressively going and say, hey, we need to begin to annex properties. This is not saying, hey, what properties would be good to be placed in the town. A lot of, when you look at annexation studies and planning, most municipalities from a larger standpoint, they're trying to solve a different, they're trying to increase either tax base or they're trying to close donut holes. That's not necessarily Kiowa's issue. For Kiowa, the issues that I think, I'm sorry how these got out of order. There we go. The issues that for Kiowa is it's going to be protecting the Kiowa identity, protecting the Kiowa brand. When we look at properties beyond the gates, we look at Freshfields, we look at the large tracts that are in the county still. We look at the properties adjacent to Town Hall, and we look at Betsy Kearse in that corridor, Bohicket. And so the land uses that are allowed in those particular properties, Kiowa wants to be able to pay attention to those, because now what develops next door now impacts what Kiowa's front door looks like. We know the approach to Bohicket Road is special. That drive, what that looks like, Kiowa should be paying attention to. So that overarching theme of what happens next beyond the gates, because of so much growth and development that is happening, River Road and Betsy Carson, that intersection will be developed at a higher density than what it is today. A lot of these things are just having the town pay attention more closely and seeing, are there things that we should position ourselves to prepare for in the future? Should we get involved directly, indirectly? A lot of this, I think, has been done great work now through the Johns Island Task Force. In my opinion, this has been the first time in the history for at least Johns Island where a group of individuals who represent a lot of different entities or a lot of different interests have sort of collectively positioned themselves to say, hey, can we agree on some certain bare minimum things that would position Johns Island to be able to have a both balance of the growth that we're seeing and preserve some of that rural historical character of farmland and agriculture that Johns Island has had. And so a lot of the work that's been done out of that task force, Charlie LaPuma and I have worked closely with that group, and I've seen fruits of it, being able to go directly to Charleston County Planning Commission and present, and the task force now have official sort of representation, communication with Charleston County, with city officials about different interests. I think the town should position itself to be aligned with some of those ideologies. In the Beyond the Gates presentation that I made before, one of those things was being able to sort of clean up some of the narratives about Kiowa just being isolated away from the pressures of growth. And so that conversation should be had from internally when we do talk about annexation. I'll bring this up fairly very quickly. We talk about the provision of services. So those would be things that would need to be thought about: the financial impact, building codes, who monitor those, Kiowa compatibility. Now, I think I can stop there if there's something directly you want to go dive in more deeply. But
John, do you get a sense, has it ever been brought up relative to the task force moving Johns Island into something more than a unincorporated Charleston County? I mean, are they relying on the city of Charleston in terms of continued annexation, or what's the sense of the people in that task force? Do they ever talk about that?
That's been something that's brought up maybe once or twice, and it's more so in the presence of someone was just unhappy with the current state of what was going on. I don't think there's been a lot of aptitude to say, hey, we need to formulate a town of Johns Island. I don't think that's the route of most folks in the task force. The city has, we talked a little bit about the urban growth boundary. The city has committed to sort of still increasing density within the urban growth boundary. The presentation or the overhaul that Charleston County has recently done in preparing for that, they wanted to increase the density on Johns Island, and that was more reflective of the decision to solve sort of the affordable housing crisis in the region by increasing the housing stock. So that was the proposal. That was really, it received a lot of negative feedback from the Johns Island Task Force because of the recommendation to increase density outside of the urban growth boundary for a couple of zoning districts. So Charleston County's Planning Commission will review that and bring back some new recommendations on that note. But those are some of the conversations that I don't think that there's an aptitude to want to formulate the town of Johns Island. And I don't think with the history of what happened on James Island, it becomes a real legal battle. And
There's their example as to why they
yeah.
not do that.
So really from this, it's the question of just, as opposed to being out here in the little Kiowa bubble, that we probably ought to increase our engagement with the rest of Johns Island.
Well, we have good representation on this, on the task force, and I think it's like everything else, we just continue to do that, continue to be a player.
Yeah, we'll be meeting Friday with John Zoglar, who's the chairman of the task force, and I've taken, I think, that his position on a lot of things is to utilize all the different players to find common ground on things that we can find common ground on. A lot of the contentious issues historically have now gained traction. Like 526 has always been something that's contentious, whether we want to admit it or not. It's just been a divisive sort of issue with historically. And I think the members of the task force, whether they have supported it, whether they have not supported it, most agree that what most agree on something as simple as we need traffic relief on Johns Island immediately. And so I think that's the fruits of those commonalities that we can build and saying, okay, what can we do to support so all get on the same page? How we get there, we may have to discuss those type things. And I think those meetings and having those meetings with our elected officials and representatives make real good fruit of that energy to be a team player, if you will.
I agree. I think we mentioned yesterday we had the chance to meet with Jenny Honeycutt, and that was brief but constructive in a sense. I'm looking forward to meeting with Anna Johnson. It's been a long time, so hopefully we can set that up and talk with her and see how she feels, about all of this. Does she come to the meetings?
She has not.
Did she send a representative?
But staff, Charleston County staff is present at the meetings.
Pardon me?
Charleston County planning staff and has been present at the meeting. Charleston City Council has two representatives for City Council regularly sort of attends. The current Planning Commission chair, Cindy Floyd, is also from the county who sits on the task force, so she's really aware as well of what's going on in Johns Island.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Good.
So the other component of Beyond the Gates, well, not really Beyond the Gates, is
I'm sorry. Get back to that.
Okay.
Do we know, are any of those up for sale? The previous slide, the one that had all the lots. That.
So.
The bottom one is. I'm sorry. What?
The bottom one is the resorts. Oliver Creek is the resort. Mr. Goodwin.
This is right before you approach the circle, so this is directly across from Town Hall. As you know, the property adjacent that has been prepared or planned for the mini golf site, so that was recently sold. Properties across from time to time will switch. We'll switch
That's
hands.
the one I'm referring to. I can't. Is it Andale?
The Andale Point tract.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
That I think it was recently sold.
That's the one.
Is that?
That's the one.
That's the one. Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
that was recently sold, and I think they're in conversations of what they want to potentially do with the site. We know for the most part, water and sewer, the issues for these properties. So that's kind of the site constraints, I think, for a lot of why these properties probably haven't been developed at a faster rate.
Yeah.
So who provides water sewer to those sites if they have it?
This would be Seabrook.
And does Seabrook have the right to say, no, we're not doing it?
Sure.
Yes.
That's the problem. Seabrook has said no.
Seabrook.
And that's why the Andale Point tract is taking so long to be developed, because prior, as soon as we moved into this building, and John, and even prior to us moving in, we're in the old town hall, there's been several prospective buyers looking at that site, and they've come to the town. Once they thought that we had the ability to provide sewer to them because of this building. We said, no, we're on septic. We said a Seabrook. They've gone to Seabrook several times, and so far they have they've said no. For whatever reasons, I don't know, but as of right now, because I don't want to put words in their mouth, and I don't know exactly why, but as of right now, they have not provided sewer. We went to Seabrook and they said no. So that's why we're on septic here.
I don't see that changing. We talked with the people from Seabrook and built a very compelling case. It would have made good economic sense for them to put us on, and they would not do that. That's just town to town because of the low usage that we have in this site. we fortunately, because of the low usage, were able to build this building and make it go because of use of septic. But I don't know what they plan on doing in any of those sites that could get by with septic.
Where's the water coming from?
No, St. John's
St. John's
Water.
St. John's Water.
Yeah, we have public water, just not sewer. Yeah.
The Donna at the Conservancy has indicated to me that a number of these tracts of land are in discussions with them about putting in some conservancy easements. And I do not know the magnitude or
That-
how far they are.
The portion of this
That would
is
be
in,
great.
That'd be
is
great.
in conservation, already. And I know well, it's I think on the other side of the river, but I know that portion of that's already in conservation.
Oh, it
He
is?
also said something about.
I believe a portion of I think the side adjacent to the marsh here, I think a portion of that is in
It's
conservation.
really an area that you won't build in anyways, but
Right.
it still is great to have it. Conservation. I would love to get the Conservancy to be able to get areas, to protect areas
So-
from not being,
So that, to
built-
that
buildable
point, the
areas.
Conservancy is working on that. I didn't include a slide on that, but part of the task force in their mission work of recently in conservation effort to look at Bessie Carson. Bessie Carson, as you know, is pretty much undeveloped for the
Stephanie,
most part. There are a few
There's
commercial
Frank
frontages.
Johnson. His is the land behind us.
But
Yeah,
they're,
that's what I was gonna
they're
mention.
trying to look at strategies to where
approach to us. That's-
a lot of that frontage can be protected away from development. So the Conservancy has, I think in their strategic plan, have looked at another sort of out beyond just the Kiowa proper. And so I know that they've looked at properties along Bessie Carson and across the river to see what efforts that they can participate to increase that conservation for Johns Island. The other track that probably we can have a small discussion on are the larger tracks outside of Charleston County. That'll be really up to the property owners whether or not what they foresee happening on these sites. But they are sort of in Kiowa's front door, if you will. They're still in unincorporated Charleston County.
But the developer, the resort owns those, everything but the sea, he owns those Oliver Creek development, that's the resort.
Correct.
And what could he do with that property today?
Well,
As
it's in the
zone,
county, so-
as zone right now, it's zone R4 in Charleston County, so houses could be built there as today.
Yeah.
I think he put up 1,000 units on it,
I have a more detailed, I think, breakdown of some of those numbers and values I can share with you. I did an internal sort of review of some of this with the previous administration to kind of discuss, I think, some of those nuances with these properties, and so I can share that with council. Good.
Okay,
Thank you, Jim.
if nobody has a compelling desire to annex any property.
We won't say that.
Not about
publicly.
compelling, but
We won't.
we gotta pay attention to it.
Two more things. I think the biggest, I think, priority for myself, it would be the comp plan review. This happens every 5 years. We got started already and sort of was paused a little bit through COVID, but we'll revisit this year and take priority to review the comp plan. I would say that a lot of the smaller studies that have been done over the last few years, the HRNA study I've referenced, what the Conservancy is doing with the groundwater and the marsh, those are all things that will help us sort of review and update the comprehensive plan. Just recently, we updated the beach management plan. I want to incorporate at least just some references of that plan within the comp plan. That's currently not within there. And then the biggest component that we've already done a great deal of work with is the sea level rise flood mitigation efforts. That's been a priority just based on all of the work that's sort of been birthed from the report that was produced in 2018. From that, I do think that we could have some conversations on strategies of the adaptive management plan. I won't go too much because I think, Jim, you may be talking a lot about this, but from a planning standpoint, the phases that I've been incorporated with Kika and Lucas and that work. Continuing that momentum is going to be important, I think, for the town and memorializing what that looks like. Mr. Capelli from our Planning Commission is adamant about us getting this marsh management plan really underway, and so I think a lot of the work that comes from the studies from the Conservancy will help us be able to at least put some things together to say how we attack the marsh side of the island. We know that we have a healthy beach, and so the report stating that our most vulnerable natural resource would be the marsh, and so are there things that we can do from a zoning standpoint to advance efforts to mitigate flooding on the marsh side or protecting the marsh. The final thing that two things, the development agreements.
I'm sorry, John, just get
I'm sorry.
on that, who's driving that development plan?
So
The next
that is the question that needs to be addressed, because water has no boundaries. Literally, it flows when we look at municipality or jurisdiction. But from today, we started with the environmental committee with the report. That's report produced recommendations. Each entity has taken on sort of their part. Kika has done a lot of infrastructure improvements. Their discussion from the town, we've done some comp plan updates review. From this point forward, I think it's going to be important for the Kewah community to sit down and say, okay, is there something collectively as a Kewah group that we all need to pay attention to? So when it comes to monitoring, I think the efforts of being able to monitor, we've installed the, what's it on the bridge, the tidal gauge. There are a lot of different elements or components to this. It's not just sort of a one fix all.
I understand.
And so each entity, each organization is going to have to play a role. And so the issue is there a leader, or is it when we just kind of operate in our silos? And that's what I think the adaptive management plan has to hit that next phase of being able to say, okay, we're going to do this piece, but we're going to communicate on these elements. So I don't think it's a clear-cut answer of, well, the town is responsible. I think the town can take lead on a lot of issues just because the breadth of our capacity, but we won't be able to touch infrastructure because most of the infrastructure is managed by the community association. So those are the type of conversations of being able to collaborate.
I can more directly answer your question, which is, because in my role as liaison, I have met with all the various stakeholders and players, and Kika is the entity that actually owns this project. The Conservancy is doing all of the basic research and providing them with the information that they need to do their monitoring piece of it. And then they will be reporting to the board, to the town council and to the Kika board about, where they are in terms of the thresholds, what action plans need to be activated, if any, that sort of thing. But right now, because as John said, Kika controls the infrastructure. They're actually the stakeholder that owns the project. And I see it as my job to make sure that Kika, the Conservancy, the Environmental Committee, and the town are all on the same wavelength and page.
Very good.
And I have set up a monthly meeting with Lee at the Conservancy and with Lucas over at Kika to, give me a monthly update and status of where we're going and what we're doing so that I can work with Jim and the Environmental Committee to make sure that we're doing our job to see to it that it's a coordinated and integrated approach.
And Scott, then you'll report out to council?
Yes, they will. They actually, when we get to that piece of the puzzle, we'll discuss that.
Okay, thank you. Very good.
I want to talk just briefly about the development agreements. I think right now, town is engaged in 2 development agreements, as we know, the developer, master developer, and then the resort. Both of those have been extended just recently, so to 26 and 27. The development agreement with the partners, we know that we just had 2 amendments to those pertaining to parcel 13. And in 2017, we had amendments to deal with Ocean Course and West Beach. I mentioned this kind of earlier, but just looking at the remaining entitlements to just ensure that, hey, we're still making progress, and just looking at those extension dates and saying, well, will the goalposts move again just based on how fast we're developing? I don't think there's a significant amount of attention, I think, when it comes to the actual crux of the development agreement, which is looking at those remaining entitlements and seeing if they align with the time frame of those extensions. I think the final component really, I think from an internal standpoint, is just looking at a few zoning ordinance amendments that will aid in some inconsistencies that I've seen over the last few years. We talked already about the flood maps that's sort of underway, which will come before your review in February. When it comes to the zoning map, in addition to the comp plan, that's the other document that is sort of a roadmap for Kiowa. And so the zoning map with Ocean Park, there's some inconsistencies there that we need to sort of clean up. The open space areas out in Ocean Park are technically still zone R2, so with them being designated open space and parks, we would like to rezone that. Question came up regarding the settlement. It's technically still zone R2, but it's been developed sort of pattern-like as R1, so it's just a conversation that maybe had whether or not we look at rezoning the settlement to R1 just as a consistency as how it's been developed. The waterfront and the marsh, I think this goes back into sort of some of the things that will come out of the comprehensive plan review and whether or not there's alternatives that we can do on the marsh side of the island, whether it's increased buffers or encourage how that OCR line impacts development. A lot of what we've seen recently are due to like bulkheads and erosion control structures. We really don't have anything that per se governs that because most of it's done through the state. But I think that we can take a visit and really put the town in a position to at least have some more review in that purview in the review process of what that looks like. The other component, tree protection. The ARB pretty much covers all of this. However, there is Eugenia, where we know that the ARB's purview is excluded for a lot of those lots. And so from a practical standpoint as staff, me coming from the county, most of the contractors and architects, I've built those relationships with them, so they will at least call me and say, hey, I have this tree, can I take it down, that kind of thing. Whereas typically the ARB would manage that process. There's nothing in our zoning ordinance that says, hey, you can remove a tree or you can't remove a tree. It's just that over time we've developed that relationship. So if it's a grand tree based on sort of from Charleston County, it would not be allowed to be removed. We don't see a lot of trees being removed, but there are some instances where site contexts are shifted. So just reviewing potentially, should we at least have some type of simple tree protection ordinance that would allow Eugenia or some of the maybe future thoughts of properties that are not just controlled by the Architectural Review Board to have some of that same protection. The final detached accessory dwelling units, we've had a couple cases. One that I'm studying right now when it comes to detached accessory dwelling units. Not sure if Mr. Parker, you were on the board at the time when we reviewed one case, but essentially I want to review this based right now. Detached accessory structures are not allowed to be placed in the front yard of a principal structure. The only exception is when it backs up to a beach or oceanfront property. And detached being that it's connected by either a roof or attached by a roof or a wall connection. There are a couple of instances where that wall connection now is expansive wall, so it feels like a detached property, but by definition, it's still attached because of the wall connection. So I'll put together something to review and maybe bring it back to Mr. Moffitt, maybe see if this is something that's interested to our planning commission to review.
So this is a case where it's, people are using the rules to their advantage?
Right,
And,
right.
And kind of not in the spirit of what the intention was?
Which happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We just want to tighten it up for a minute.
Yeah.
I just want to, as John was talking through the roles and responsibilities of planning department, and we talked about the AMP plan. Now, one of the things that I was thinking about when we talked about ARB is what I would love as an initiative this year. We looked at it a couple of years ago, and I see it as kind of a reoccurring confusion or problem with residents, because I hear so much of, we're a town, we're responsible for the public health, safety, and welfare of the community. We set regulatory policies. KICA, for the most part, can't set regulatory policies, but they have the infrastructure. So a number of things, if we want it to happen, has to come through the town so that we can set regulatory processes. And then we have ARB that has, they're dealing with aesthetics, but then we talk about the tree protection, and naturally, when you have a developer or contractor that's looking to do certain things, they naturally come to the town. But then we may say, nope, you have to go to ARB or you have to go to KICA, and then they just get confused. And they get, because there's really, which is not, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think sometimes we're just so intertwined with each other that it gets so confusing for homeowners or contractors to say, who's on first, who's on second, where do we go? Everyone keeps pointing this direction, but you're a town, we set regulatory policies, but yet you keep sending us all these different directions. Or as a homeowner, they may come to ARB and they're like, nope, it's the town, and they get so confused that I'm wondering if we should, and I don't know, maybe there's nothing that we can really do, but just kind of re-look at it, understand who's all responsible for what, and somehow be able to clearly articulate that information or understand, even from planning and zoning, what is it that we should say, okay, we got this, we're going to go ahead. We now have a planning department, one person, maybe that needs to grow to 2 people, I don't know. But even with the marsh management study, which is great that we're funding the Conservancy, they're in their 2nd year of a grant from the town to look at the groundwater and marsh management plan. And the idea, because this started conversation with the Planning Commission, I think, is that, and even with Jim, is we don't have, and this is, the beach management plan is mandated by the state. There's nothing mandating the marsh management plan. We need that. So the Conservancy is great. We're funding them to start doing some initial research. They're going to turn it over to us. I've already said I don't have the staff to do a marsh management plan right. So ultimately, I would like to get a consultant, and we'll probably be the first, or maybe the 2nd community to actually develop a marsh management plan, which is something I know a lot of communities. I was on a call just yesterday, and they're looking at these things, and they're like, oh, that's so great. We wish we were able to do it. It will probably be like a model for some communities, but there's just so much going on that I just sit and just trying to help staff understand how to navigate, because I think, the mayor asked a great question of John, is who takes ownership of the AMP plan? And Dr. Parker, you're right, but I also think it's a relationship for the town's standpoint, because at some point, when they get to that point, they're going to come to us, and we're going to have to set the regulatory policy, if that's something.
What makes it even more confusing, a lot of folks know, okay, I used to go to Charleston County to get things done, and so with now planning me in-house, we still have those sometimes. Oh, I thought I had to go to the county, just cleaning up. So yeah, it's.
I think as we were talking about earlier, I think it's just the dominance of the developer, dominance of the developers is just changing. Mm-hmm. And for this community for the past decades, it was the developer was able to control so much.
Right.
And I think the linchpin in this whole thing, honestly, I do, is the ARB. And I think however we address it, however it's finalized, whether it's later, but I think it could be sooner. you know, I think it could be sooner. And, because I just don't see them having that ongoing requirement of the control of the ARB for any length of time. I mean, you know, we knew it way back when, that's why it was put into the agreement, that at some point it would transition out. You know, it's a matter of when that trigger is pulled, and then to whom. And I honestly don't see the association biting at the bullet saying, boy, that's a dream come true for us. You know, we're gonna have control of the ARB. I honestly think it would be a nightmare.
The permitting process as well, I mean, that, the ARB, that's another
Right, I just don't,
conversation in itself.
because of that, Stephanie, their intent is not to be regulators. I mean, that's the way it was. Right. Is that mean that that's by goal, by not by statute, but by their mission. That isn't what they're intended to be. The town was to be the regulators and the association. I mean, so way back when it was organized like that, and I just don't.
So what I'm hearing then is that the long range goal would be to put everything under the town's umbrella and have it be one-stop shopping for everybody.
Yes, that's what I would.
For me, Scott, I mean, that's how
That's
I
like
view that, Scott.
Yes.
And it's not a matter of empire building. I mean, whether it's today or years from now, but at some point it's going to have to be addressed. And this is this is the regulatory entity the town is, and I think then it really would become a mixed mash. I mean, you can imagine being the association and trying to tell people what they can do and trying to keep. I mean, it's.
I can see the roadmap would look like old Jeffy's route from the bus stop home and family service.
Yeah.
The other thing I think we have to be thoughtful about is, I think if the four partners who are the operators of the development intend to keep, which they say they do, the real estate business and the club business, you know, they've begun to tie those together now into one logo, so you can see where they're going. They plan to hold on to that. We gotta make sure they don't plan to hold on to the ARB in the long run.
I can't believe they would want to hold on to it in the long
I
run.
would use it as a
marketing tool.
But yeah, that's exactly right. It's an important marketing tool today because they can allow things that allow them to do something that maybe wouldn't normally have been allowed. So we may want to put some pressure on them over the next few years to get rid of it, bring it here. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but
Yeah.
are you ready to go?
Yeah, just like it.
Particularly if you're talking about we were talking about earlier about the redevelopment of existing projects, and existing properties, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, because there's going to be less new development.
Right.
So more for us to do, less for them to do.
So Stephanie, go back to what you were saying. You're saying that you see as something that we probably ought to do is to, I don't want to say we go back to the maze of caves, but essentially go back and start maybe making sure that that's more clearly stated for everybody. Is that kind of where you're headed there? Who's responsible for what?
Well, it's just more of the long term as we're talking about. I think the mayor and Dan really articulated well what I think I was trying to say is that ultimately, in terms of we're a regulatory entity, and I think sometimes it gets very confusing for others when it appears that, I'm not saying we're doing it, but if stuff is pushed out to ARB or KICA that really should be a regulatory, and in anyone's mind it should come from the town, but it appears that we're pushing it out to other entities, that can become a problem when they don't really have the arm to regulate certain requirements, because then they'll come back to us and say, okay, this is a great idea, but we don't have the teeth to regulate it, or we don't want to regulate it, and so then it's back in our wheelhouse, which is fine. So if that's the case, and I think the town should always take the lead and work with the entities if we need to, and I think we should in a lot of things. But ultimately, it comes back to the town, and even with ARB, I probably for the last year or two, and I know the development agreement, I've even said that at some point, I think the town should consider taking on that role. A lot of municipalities do take on that role, but also I think it helps the greater community, because what I would ultimately like to see is that we've talked about this one-stop shop. We've tried to create it with Kika and ARB. I'm not saying that they have not wanting to do that, but the clear matter is that we're a public entity. They are a private entity, and it becomes very tough in sharing information and having a number of those things in-house. We are truly creating a one-stop shop, which makes it much easier for, I would think, a homeowner who wants to renovate their property or new construction or contractors. They basically go to one source for the most part, and then they're able to basically get everything answered or addressed. And I think the community association can get back to doing the great things that they do, which is creating amenities and doing things for the property owners, and trying not to figure out if they have to amend their covenants or bylaws to be a regulatory arm when that's not maybe what they feel is their strength. Because we worked well together when we had a house that we had to demolish. The community association came to us and said, you know, you all have a much deeper regulatory process. We need help, and we went in and we turned Barry. We end up through Bruce's department condemning the property and then going in and tearing it down. So I think ultimately all I'm just saying is that yeah, with the Mesa case, if we can really simplify it, and ultimately over time, we start really drilling down and saying, okay, this is the town's role, these are responsibilities we're going to take, and then stop you know, throwing confusion out there with talking about all the different cases. And I think Dan put it great yesterday, Kika's even going to the community. Maybe we go to town and just start. So, you know, I'm not sure, but I just think it's something that we have to really think about, and I would love to be able to kind of talk that through as the year goes on.
Well, I think, yeah, I think you can always improve just communicating the existing, but I think as we, not to be redundant, but things have to change substantively to be able to really say we've made things easier for, you know, to be able to live here. You know, and I think that's going to take organizational changes. I do think, again, years to come, but the big development is going to be that everything that the Goodwin family owns, you know, maybe some point, but that's a big swath of land. I'm not sure how many acres that is, John, when you put that, there's a lot of acreage, and, you know, maybe none of us will see it, maybe, I don't know, decades, because you hear nothing, but in terms of what the town of Kiowa could look like, I mean, just envision that. Just envision the project that they're putting out in the corner of River Road. If something like that would evolve here over the next, you know, 20 years, and I mean, the town of Kiowa could become a much different looking town. Yeah. You know, we talk in terms of Cacique, and they're in the town or not in the town. Of course, they're not in the town, but it's kind of sort of like they're almost like in the town. But just think about hundreds of homes being down there, what that would be like. It would be but again, that's the, we'll just have to wait and see. Just have to wait and see. John, thank you. Very thought-provoking, for sure.
Okay, for this next part.
Well, do you want to, I'm sorry, it's 10 till 10. You want to quick break till 10, and then Scott will get started? Is that okay?
But I'll go ahead and preface this now. This agenda is wrong. It says Dr. Parker and staff. It ought to read staff with Dr. Parker listening.
I
thought that I'd say that.
I missed the presentations already. So
What is this? Better yesterday, yeah. This. Did you put that on? I think I did. Yeah, you did. So are we gonna get together and do something on this together, or?
The audit compliance is not, you know,
I was unsure, but I did say yesterday what I was gonna do.
yeah, this is the one that I said that, what?
I've gotten some information.
Oh, okay.
So I can share that with you, and we can see if that helps us focus.
Yeah, you can, send me an email of your availability, and we can
I will.
whenever you're ready.
Okay.
so then if you have a tree regulation,
Nice job.
it said, you know, can't be bigger than this, whatever, however the regulation read, then that would say, well, these tree doesn't have to replace whatever.
No, actually, probably like that. Depending then on what.
Well, now, because then the deal with new property is if you cut a tree, you have to replace the inches of diameter. And how much.
Oh, Mayor, I just told Wendy,
It's,
she had a question,
so it's a consequence
and, before we start,
is.
before we start into this session here, when we come out of our break, I will ask her, I answered her question. So her question was, has the town looked into the cost of taking over the ARB and the economic implications to town Kika, the ARB, has the town had any discussions with Kika about this? And then I just said, not yet about the ARB, just starting the conversation. But she would actually like for me to raise it as a question. So while we're still,
We're kind of on that subject.
yeah, while we're still on that subject, so when we come out of the session, I'll let Scott know as well. But I think that conversation should start sooner rather than later.
That was my point, and I don't think it should be with
Because it's not-
John or anybody. It should be with me and, David. And,
Because that is something that if we start the transition, because actually ARB has already started transitioning some of the work to Kika. Just in terms of they're doing the maintenance stuff, Kika is, so they've started that slowly, but Kika really doesn't want to take over, at least is what I'm hearing, the full-fledged ARB, because they're saying we're a community association.
well, and I think that the umbrellas aren't necessarily what logo or what it's called or whatever. The umbrellas are, who's the regulatory agency?
That's what I was trying to
What's the regulatory authority? Is the town? What's the,
Right.
whatever we want to call what the, the association, the community.
Right.
um,
They're a community association, and so
They're the-
that's why I've been pushing it from a regulatory standpoint. It'd be great if ARB come into the town, because a lot of municipalities have ARBs and DRBs, and because some of the things that they do really works hand in glove with planning department and building services. From a one-stop shop, it is a much easier process for people
of course.
looking to do work here on the island to basically have the arm of ARB or DRB, whatever you want to call it, in the planning department building services. I was talking about the fact that the ARB, while they may not have really regulatory responsibilities, they kind of quasi do, and if they're here, then someone basically can go from the ARB to planning and building services, and then we can actually all communicate together. Right now, we can't with ARB because they're saying, well, you're private, we're public, and so even though we got the same software program, we can't communicate with them because they don't want to get involved with FOIA requirements, which I completely understand because they're saying, look, we're private.
It's
So-
just, to me, Stephanie, it's a continuation of the strategy that we implemented when we were all housed in the same house. We had to separate the houses, so now that's gone, that's been done. It's the recruitment of a young fellow like John Taylor.
Yeah.
We didn't have that function, it was the county. Well, we knew we weren't gonna get anyway as long as it was the county. So he's brought it in-house, now we have him, he's matured, and now
Right.
we have,
Building services we brought in.
building services we brought in, we didn't have building services,
Yeah.
now we have building services. So it all, and we have now the facility to be able to
Yeah.
embed them in the functioning of,
Right.
of the town administrators. I mean, it all took time, but it is time. I mean,
We're maturing as a town, and our
we're
community is
maturing and
growing.
sophisticated enough.
Yeah.
God love these people. They get into, whizzing contests over
Yeah.
who's gonna use the pool.
Yeah, I know. That's not, that's something fine for
Well,
the
no,
community association.
but they have to, they
Right.
have to. I mean,
That's what
they
I'm
have a
saying,
very engaged, we're a very engaged community. That's the types of things that and this board, there will always be issues relative to trees and plantings and all of the infrastructure changes that are gonna go along with the aging island
Right.
itself. Yeah, they don't,
Yeah, they have a lot of other
They need to
things to worry
focus on
about.
what they need to focus on.
Right,
they need to focus,
Yeah.
as do we.
yeah.
As do we. And and again, it's not a matter of empire building, but until those things are housed in the appropriate venue, both
Right.
physically
Yeah,
or managerially,
Right.
you can't get around that by just moving signs and things like
Right.
that. It has to be done structurally.
It has to be done structurally.
I need a water.
Just so you know, before you start, Wendy Coolett had a question dealing with the last conversation, so we're going to
Okay,
let
sure.
her introduce her question, which was, I answered it, but she wants it to be, which is fine.
She wants it to be in the record.
Yeah, she just said, has the town looked into the cost of taking over the ARB and the economic implications to the town, Kika, and the ARB? Her second question, has the town had any discussions with Kika about this? So,
Now, I have a question,
yes,
and I was reading the plastics ordinance last night.
yes,
And I mean, because this, when we came up yesterday, I remembered that it was originally written as straws, you know, or in the Neal. Now, I happen to know that the club is using plastic straws.
yes, they are.
Okay. Why is it that they are doing that, and yet they are subject to our mask requirements? What makes those two ordinances? Because we got an ordinance that says you will not do this, and we got an ordinance that says you will do this. We have written it such that the club is,
Well, I'm going back to the plastic. I'm not quite understanding what you're saying.
it's a foundational question. It's
Yeah.
not about plastic per se.
Because they're abiding by a plastic ordinance.
No, they're using plastic straws.
No, we've already looked into that. The plastic straws that they're using meet the requirements because they have a certain amount of
Okay,
thickness.
okay,
So
then that's a misunderstanding on my part.
yeah, because we
Okay.
went around with them on this in gym, and we actually looked at it, and so even though it's plastic, it meets the
Okay,
the fact
in
that
that case, that's,
yeah.
but
So they're
that's,
in compliance with the plastic.
okay,
ordinance.
but that's the reason why I
Yeah.
wanted to review
Okay,
it,
that's
because
fine.
it was just a foundational
Yeah,
thing.
because because I went there, Craig and I went there, and we met with the new manager, or the Kika Resort person, and I'm sitting here, I bring out a straw, and I'm like, these are plastic straws, and I'm like, Jim, he's like, no, I already looked into it, the straws, the plastic straws have a certain thickness to them,
Okay,
so they meet.
that's fine.
Yeah, okay. That it will be? Oh, okay.
What was that, Mary Ann?
PGA,
Oh, really?
Everything's lovely. Keep it.
oh, okay, that's good. I know they're thinking about, they're obviously looking at either not having full spectator, and doing a partial spectator, but they have to make the decision. I was told by the end of this month, or beginning of next month, and so they were leaning towards having a partial spectator.
That would work better, I think.
But I think if they're going
That's a big
full-
deal because the numbers that Roger told me that if it was full attendance, it could be 40,000 people,
Yeah.
and if it was partial, it could be 10. That's 30,000 people
Yeah,
difference.
and if Scott,
Buses are still full
Pardon me?
though. The shuttle buses are still
so
full.
I don't know if they made the decision, but if Scott said so,
He said that they talked to but, you know, that would change.
Is this an announcement? Does this just come out?
I heard this.
yeah.
Oh,
I don't think it's an official announcement.
oh, okay.
No, because they're still looking into it. Maybe they've just been investigating it, but they were really kind of looking towards a partial spectatorship. So I'm surprised they're doing full, but they're gonna do full.
They consider this very different than the Masters.
Yeah. It'll be interesting, but I don't know, so we'll find out once it's announced. Okay, no, that's perfect. I talked to
Well, it's I think it's going to be the optimism of the supply of the vaccine. I think all of these medical centers and hospitals and towns, everybody's gearing up for being able to administer it. You know, the software systems are in place, they're ready to go. It's just a matter if there's an adequate supply, if they can keep the supply.
Yeah.
What did you think about what Rob said yesterday? About the doctor that the beach resort uses?
I'm gonna talk with him more about it.
That's not very promising. Rob was telling us yesterday that.
Well, I'm not sure. And it's not public.
trying to push them out of the water.
Okay, ready to go? John, I thought I just saw John. Okay, just a minute
Where's
for
the
John.
environmental dude? There he is, trying to hide it.
Put my question out. You can read it.
Other question?
Yes. Jim?
Hold on
we
one
have-
second. What are these guys?
Oh, wait.
Get
We
back.
have one, no, I was just saying, we have one question before you're ready to go.
Okay.
If you wanna, you can stand or you can sit, whichever one you prefer.
I'll go back.
You're welcome to stand there if you like, but this may not be a long discussion.
Stephanie, we do have a question.
Okay, we're kind of reconvening now. I have a question that came in from Ms. Wendy Kulik. The question it deals with our last conversation. She had asked, has the town looked into the cost of taking over the ARB and the economic implications to the town, Kika, and the ARB is her first question. And then the second question, has the town had any discussions with Kika about it? So I will let the mayor, if you'd like to answer that, or?
Well, the short answer is no, we haven't. But I think from our discussion, I think we will, we should. And I really will look forward to talking with them about it. I think it's, I think that no matter how hard we try to make things easier for the community for residents to be able to go through the different entities that are set up, until we do something structurally, it's still going to be, it's still going to be confusing. It's still going to be possibly too much overlap. And as I was sharing with Stephanie and Scott just a second ago, way back when, it really was, the genesis was we needed to separate the town and the association from that building. Way back when, we didn't have the planning activity. We were buying those services. We didn't have building services. We were buying those services. You know, those are all part of the town now. The town is the regulatory activity for this community. The association has grown by leaps and bounds in terms of the responsibilities that they have, and they'll continue to have. So I think the oversight has to be in terms of where we're going to put regulatory activities and where we're going to, put community-based activities. So, I mean, that's going to be, no, I don't mean to preempt this, and since we're live, I mean, to talk to people that we haven't had a chance to talk to. That's just my own personal feeling, and I'll talk to, I know what it says in the agreement, the development agreement per se, but that was just at a different era and time than it is in 2021, for sure, and as we go forward. So we're far more sophisticated, far more mature than the town activities were than we were 10, 15, 20 years ago, as is the association. As is the association. They have an enormous, book of work that they are responsible for. So, no, we haven't had those conversations. In terms of cost implications, I don't really know what they would be. would have to think that through. But I think that's an activity that needs to be pursued. We plan on doing it.
Staff would obviously be the big cost. Staff would obviously be the big cost.
Oh, no, it's a transfer. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But I'm just saying it's not like it is additive in the sense that we don't, but it's being paid for in a sense, well, maybe not. I don't know how. We'd have to look at all of that.
We obviously also have to engage the partners.
Yeah, that's.
Anyone else have any comment on that before we go ahead and start the next session? No? Okay. Thank you.
Make me proud.
Did my best.
All right. Let's see. So I thought I'd just start with just a brief overview of the environmental department, which is the department that I head. We have 2 employees, myself and Aaron. I've been here since 2000. We hired Aaron in 2008. So the fact that, you know, as a town we have 2 full-time biologists is quite a testament to, you know, how serious we are about protecting and managing the Kiowa environment. And so our department mission is to manage, promote, and maintain the town's natural resources through research, monitoring, management, and public education. So I've got there were a number of topics here on the agenda, and I'm going to kind of run through them, and we can you know, spend as long or as little time on each of these as you want to. My comments on each of them will be fairly brief and general, and then we can have, you know, a more in-depth discussion. So the first is, you know, the flood mitigation sea level rise adaptive management plan, something John touched on moments ago. So all of this came out of, you know, as John said, you know, a subgroup of the environmental committee worked for about 2 years to produce a report on flood mitigation and sea level rise. Kind of brought that issue to the forefront of the community, and then a number of things have happened since then. So the concept of an adaptive management plan came out of that original report. And so just in general, you know, what is adaptive management? What does it mean? It's basically just a concept for managing complex systems with unpredictable influence. So obviously the Kiowa environment is a complex system, and the rate of, you know, sea level rise and flooding events are unpredictable influences. So it's a strategy that's well designed for the situation we're in. It was actually developed by the Department of the Interior, and it's got 3 main phases, 3 main components. So the first component of the first phase is stakeholder engagement and threshold definition. So that work has been completed. Most of that work was completed basically by Lucas Hernandez and a group kind of operating under the community association. And then to the right, so during that process, they identified a number of thresholds or categories, you know, to then monitor and apply adaptive management to. And those are roads, utilities, property, both public and private, access to amenities, beach and dunes, salt marsh, maritime forest, and vegetation. So that's, you know, phase 1 pretty much define the thresholds, and then phase 2 is to develop a monitoring program for those areas. And then the final phase is to design a response plan, you know, based on the monitoring and trigger points and a number of other things. So as I mentioned, you know, this is in phase 2, and so these objectives for the coming calendar year came from Lucas. And so what he's going to be working on you know, throughout this year is just reviewing the threshold areas, consolidating current management plans and monitoring activities, so what's already going on, collect some additional information on the threshold areas where needed, complete the threshold definitions, and then hopefully by the end of the year have recommendations or a draft monitoring program for all of these thresholds. So that would take us to the end of phase 2 effectively. And then this is an example that Lucas provided for me that just kind of shows, you know, what does this all look like at the end of the day. And so, you know, you start with your threshold, you know, which in this case deal with roads, and then, you know, your next column is triggers. So what are the triggers that, you know, would kind of lead you to need to take action, you know, and so in this example, one of those is, you know, if flooding occurs, you know, 12 inches or more of flooding occurs in the roads, and if that happens a certain number of times over a certain period of time. And this is just kind of an example for now. So, you know, you set your trigger points, and then your response plan, you know, so what do you do when that happens, when you see these trigger points, you know, kind of what is your plan of action? And then your indicators, so kind of what are you monitoring on this issue to know what's going on, your schedule for monitoring, how often you're doing it. And then obviously the last column, which is an important one, is, you know, who's responsible for that. So it's not always going to be KICA. You know, some of these are going to be the town. Obviously Beach and Dunes is right in our wheelhouse, and marshes as well. And so that's, you know, in general what the concept of this is. I think we all agree it's a very important effort, and we want to see it proceed as quickly as possible. So at this point, we're probably 2 years away from a full scale adaptive management plan for flooding and, on the island. So that's all I have on that. I don't know if there's any discussions or comments around that, and if not, I'll move on.
I mean, just to reiterate what Jim said, I mean, this is a long-range plan and a long-range process to get to where we need to be, and we need to not lose focus and sight on it. And our big responsibility as the town is to, one, make sure that focus is maintained, and that any necessary funding that is required for the monitoring piece of this puzzle is that we're fully supportive of it as best we can.
Thank you, Scott. That was where I was going. So needs that you may have, Jim, that's, again, part of this. You'll keep coming back. You'll either look at them within the existing budget. These are things that you're going to be considering expenditures in the 2021, and then plans for 21-22 financial. Yeah. Like what would they be? Just an example of.
Well, I mean, you know, certainly one example is the conservancy projects, which I'll touch on briefly. You know, which look at the groundwater table change over time. Obviously, that's going to be a monitoring effort or a monitoring strategy for probably a number of those thresholds. You know, the maritime forest, you know, and other all of the vegetation on Kiowa is very much influenced by the groundwater table and how fresh or salt it is. So. And then obviously with the marsh monitoring, some of the work that the Conservancy plans to kind of follow up on the original marsh project, we'll look at a number of you know, I guess the ways of monitoring long-term marsh health, which can be, you know, one way to do that is to look at the ratio of vegetated to unvegetated marshlands. And as that changes over time, it basically tells you, you know, is your marsh declining or is it doing good or not? And so obviously that's a monitoring effort, you know, under this adapted plan for the marsh. So.
And this monitoring is housed in the Conservancy because of their staff? Have they outsourced some of this?
It's all outsourced. For the most part. So. And maybe it'd be good just to kind of touch on the Conservancy, you know, projects now, and so the Conservancy. Well, let me go ahead and touch on the topic of the Conservancy now, because I think it ties in very well and kind of. Yeah, I don't have any slides for those. So.
Don't go to those.
I'm not going to go to those. So in general, the town has had a very long-term relationship with the Conservancy since its founding, and how we have kind of worked together. You know, the funding the town has provided has changed over time. You know, early on in the early 2000s, the town gave the Conservancy $100,000 a year, no strings attached. Here's a check for $100,000. Use it to, you know, further your mission. Sometime around 2005, 2006, the town stopped giving the Conservancy that $100,000. And at that point, the Conservancy started coming to the town through state aid tax as well as charitable contributions to basically get money for pertinent projects. And then that changed probably 4 or 5 years ago, where the Conservancy would come directly to the Environmental Committee to present projects, and then those projects would be vetted and recommended to council to go in the budget. And then in about 2 years ago, the town kind of changed a little bit. We changed that process a little bit, and we basically went to the Conservancy and said, we want you to design projects around these pertinent topics. And one of them was sea level rise, flooding in the marsh. And so we then worked collaboratively with the College of Charleston. And so the marsh project, the marsh vulnerability study, and the groundwater project are both College of Charleston graduate student projects. And so they are driven by that university. The expertise comes from the college. And so that's kind of how all that started, and why the Conservancy, at least in these two areas, is very involved in kind of leading the research data collection.
And Lucas Hernandez is from the College of Charleston.
Yeah. So during the early parts of the flood mitigation sea level rise work within the environmental committee, this is in the 2017 era. We were working with Norm Levine also at the college, and Lucas was a graduate student at the time who worked with us on that project, and that led to his full-time employment eventually with Kika, as their resilience specialist.
So what do we fund? We fund the study? Do we fund Lucas?
We do.
No.
We do not.
We do not.
So in our current budget, we're basically funding the projects in their entirety. So we're paying the college for the work that they're providing. We're providing funds for equipment that initially was purchased by the college, but a lot of that equipment now is being purchased directly by the Conservancy. And that's especially for the groundwater project, where they're planning long-term monitoring, going many, many years, and the college's involvement probably declining over time, and it kind of more coming in-house for the Conservancy to do that long-term. So they've purchased a number of these, level loggers and monitoring systems for these wells.
Very interesting.
And then so obviously during the budget process, so the Conservancy has effectively completed phase 1 of both of these projects, and now they're moving into phase 2 for each of these projects. So their plans for phase 2 will come to the Environmental Committee hopefully in pretty good detail in March. And then obviously at that point, we'll have a dollar amount for that, and then that'll be a recommendation in the budget for the Conservancy funding for the next fiscal year. And then obviously that decision will be made, and based on how many funds, then, we'll determine which projects are done.
Didn't phase 2, they just presented that to council at the November meeting, and they had approved it as part of the budget?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, they came and did a presentation.
They did a presentation.
They did.
Said, here's what we learned from phase 1, this is what we're gonna be doing in phase 2. But right now Lucas is putting together what phase 2 looks like at a very granular level.
I know it's
Yeah.
two different projects, but what I presented in council's report was said phase 2, and it was a funding amount with it. It was 74,000. We put that in the budget, in the amended budget.
It was,
For this fiscal year.
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it was
Right, so
like-
that's still phase 1. Phase 1 is ongoing right now.
Well, we can talk afterwards. When letting you know, when Lee came to us and what he gave to me was for phase 2, and we presented that, and that was $74,000 that was approved in the amended budget. And maybe Lee, when he was giving me that information, he wasn't clear. So,
Right.
as I said, has the environmental committee vetted this already? And they said, yes, it was approved. So we wouldn't have to put it on the budget. And so it's actually now, phase 2 is approved. Or it's in the budget.
Okay, I see where the confusion is.
Yeah.
It's not that phase 2 has been completed, it's that we have funded the materials that he needs to do phase 2.
Right, we funded it 74, I think it was 74,000 or wherever the amount, but that was put in for the amended budget.
They needed to, get the funding so that they could
Yeah,
get the monitoring
yeah, but
system in place.
so just let you know, that's been put in this current budget.
Okay. Well, there'll be additional funds for additional work in the next fiscal year.
Oh, okay.
Call it phase 3 if you want.
Oh, okay.
Or phase 2.0
Yeah, because
or
if you
2.2.
recall, the mayor at the time asked, now is this going to be the last phase? Because it was 2, and Lee said, yes, it will be the last phase.
It'll just be a very long phase.
Yeah, he did say that was the last phase, because that was asked of him, and he said, yes, phase 2 is the last phase.
All right. We're gonna move away from that one. All right.
Just one other question. Who has rights to publish? This College of Charleston, is some of this stuff publishable? I would imagine.
Yeah,
It has
for
to be
sure.
some pretty interesting
Absolutely.
research studies. Their intellectual rights, is there an agreement? Can they publish it?
They can.
They can.
They can. And we do have, I forget exactly what is in the contract with the college, but it does talk about rights to publish and, you know, who owns the intellectual property of it.
And I think there's going to be more attention given to climate or whatever. And I
For
think
sure.
as such, there are going to be communities all over the country that will be looking at different types of studies that are being done.
Some of these, you know, the Marksville Redwood study for other communities would be very valuable.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay, now,
All right. So now we're going to move to anticoagulant rodenticides and wildlife. So I know this is a topic that I'm sure all of you have heard a lot about. So I won't, you know, dwell too much on, you know, a lot of details. Hopefully you've all heard this, but I'll just, you know, briefly kind of highlight, you know, what these compounds are, what the issues are, kind of what's happened over the last 14 to 16 months, and then, you know, hopefully, you know, some discussion on where do we go next. So in general, second generation anticoagulants, you know, we call them SGAs. You know, they're just a type of poison used to control rats and mice. They work by inhibiting the recycling of vitamin K in the body. Vitamin K is vital to the blood clotting process, and so in the absence of vitamin K, these rodents bleed to death internally, typically 3 to 7 days after they consume a lethal dose. So there are 2 types of anticoagulants. They're first generation and second generation. The second generation ones were developed in the 70s, basically as rats and mice became resistant to the first generation anticoagulants. They developed these second gen ones. They're much more lethal to rodents. So they're lethal after a single feeding, whereas the first gen products, a rodent had to eat it a couple of times over the course of a week or 2 before they built up a lethal dose, and it led to their death. The other issue with SGAs and why they cause so many problems for wildlife is, you know, like I said, it takes 3 to 7 days for that rodent to die, but when he eats the bait, he doesn't feel sick for 3 to 7 days. He doesn't really feel sick until he starts to, you know, to die after almost a week. So they keep eating the bait. And so they build up more and more of this in their liver before they die. And then obviously any predator that eats them is going to pick that product up. You know, it's the whole bioaccumulation, you know, theory, right? A small thing eats a tiny bit, and then a bigger animal eats that one and builds it up, and then a bigger animal, you know, so every time it goes up the food chain, it's just getting more and more concentrated. And so that's, you know, basically what the issue that we're seeing out here with our bobcats in particular. So this is a very busy slide. And so I'm not gonna read everything on here, obviously. This is just a, you know, kind of an overview timeline of when we discovered the problem, and kind of brings us to present day. So I'll just highlight kind of a few of them. So it was 2017 when we first started to notice that our bobcat population was declining. We saw a increase in our deer population at the same time. And at this point, we think our population of bobcats has declined from 30 to 35 to less than 10. We've seen our annual mortality rate for bobcats. Historically, you know, we've been doing research on bobcats since 2000. Annual mortality rates have been around 10% or less. In the last 3 years, we've seen mortality rates as high as 75%. So a drastic change in mortality rates, and obviously, you know, when a lot more animals are dying, populations, you know, decline. And so obviously at that point, we still didn't really know what was going on. So we figured that out in August of 2019 when we picked up a dead collared female bobcat, and the lab determined that she died from bleeding to death from basically accumulating these anticoagulants. So in February of 2020, we started collecting, you know, all other animals, in particular, you know, any predators that we were finding dead or dying on the island. We started picking them up and taking liver samples. And I'll share a little bit of that data with you. And so at that point, you know, I was convinced, I think, you know, we were convinced there was an issue and we needed to act on it. So in April of 2020, Town Council planned to pass or to discuss and consider passing an ordinance to regulate the use of these products on Kiowa. It wouldn't have banned them outright. It would have simply banned their use except for very specific circumstances, threats to public safety, public health, you know, food establishments, that sort of thing. At that point, we were informed by the state that we could not regulate pesticides in any way, that only the Clemson Department of Pesticide Regulation could do that. So that ordinance was pulled. In May of 2020, we found another dead bobcat, same cause of death. In June of 2020, another one, same cause of death. This one died during labor with along with 4 of her kittens. So kind of those 2 events triggered us to say, okay, we got to do something. We can't regulate it. So we decided to ask the DPR for a 1-year moratorium, which we did July 14th. They denied that request on August 7th of 2020. And so, you know, at that point, they denied it and said, okay, and I guess I skipped, you know, that we launched our Bobcat Guardian program July 17th of 2020, you know, which is our voluntary program to encourage individuals and companies and other businesses to stop using these products. So then in August, DPR denied our request. You know, they denied it basically saying, we think voluntary efforts are going to work and we're going to do a number of things. We're going to form this task force. We're going to gather a lot of data to basically prove that the voluntary efforts are working. And so that process continued until the end of November of 2020 when they provided their task force report.
And what did that report say?
And so I'll touch on that. And so the objectives of the task force, there were seven objectives. And these objectives arose out of a number of discussions between the director of the DPR, Senator Chip Campson was involved, as well as Mayor Weaver. And so the task force, you know, was formed by DPR to basically address these 7 things. And so the first was to encourage voluntary industry compliance to stop using SGAs. Second was to develop a best management practices document for the use of SGAs. Third was an awareness and training program for residents and non-resident homeowners. Fourth was information on the number of pest control accounts on Kiowa. 5 was regulatory compliance audits and inspections performed by Clemson. 6 was research and measure the efficacy of these voluntary and educational efforts. And 7 was to get assistance from South Carolina DNR. So they did provide a report which touched on a number of these items. In discussions we've had, you know, they really didn't deliver on most of them, honestly. And so that's kind of where we are now, is, you know, we've had a couple of meetings. I've actually drafted a letter basically going through these 7 objectives, stating what was provided, and then, you know, either stating that we think that is satisfactory, you know, we think that meets their promise, or it doesn't. And if not, then what would we like them, you know, what additional information do we think we need?
So, can I ask a question?
Mhm.
I'm a pretty simple guy.
Yep.
This first objective, which says voluntary industry compliance with a no SGA policy, don't
So-
understand why they would be reluctant to, at a minimum, do a moratorium on it for a year.
I think in general, you know, the view of DPR, it remains that these products have a place in pest management everywhere in the state. And so, you know, they don't want to, you know, as they like to say, take that tool, you know, out of the quiver of any of these companies. So they still maintain, you know, they agree there's a problem, that they want to help solve it, or, you know, but they are adamant that a ban or a moratorium or any regulation is not the way to do it.
Their approach, in my opinion, is to just paint over the problem.
Yeah, that's,
And, you know, and they seem to be very resistant to taking what you just said is the very logical step, which is to say, in our little fragile, unique ecosystem, they have no place. We have had many conversations, and they just don't, they can't see the Occam's razor, logic of that.
so are there alternatives to these SGAs that are effective in our environment?
Yes, there are. There are two products that, you know, are two different chemical active ingredients that are put into baits that look the same, pretty much are just as efficient at killing rodents, and have much lower, you know, they could potentially still have secondary impacts to wildlife, but they're much lower than these products.
John, I look at it a little bit differently. And this is just 60 days of looking at this stuff. I look at it as the phenomenon of slippery slope. There's a very close relationship between the regulators and the industry.
Oh, yeah.
And I think in some communities, specifically like take a California, it's banned. But that's California, some would say. This is South Carolina, some would say. Things are different. And I think the notion of regulation is just accepted differently in some communities more than others. So I think that no one's disagreeing with any of this. But what they're saying is, but to regulate it, you know, that's where the rub comes into play. And as tragic as that may sound, this is just analogous to other situations, whether it's another number of other situations that occur in our life that'll vary from community to community around the country. But these lobbyists, or I guess the applicators, the folks that do that, the industry, powerful group down here.
So how effective have we been on our voluntary program?
That's a good question, and the answer is we really don't know. You know, we know that we've gotten almost 30 companies to take the pledge. You know, we've got, what, 635 residents that have signed up. You know,
How many companies do we have out here that are doing this work?
well, that's another whole question. So.
Maybe charms around that as well. One of the things that they promised that they would do audits, and they have instead relied upon voluntary self-reporting. And
Anonymous voluntary self-reporting.
So as best we can tell, or as best that they can provide us with information, there's only one company out there that has less than 10 accounts that they're servicing. And they tell us that the problem, that they think the problem is property managers who can actually buy this stuff online and then use it wherever they want. And that the issue is that people who rent and correct me if I've got this wrong, but the people who rent their homes out, they've got a rat problem if one of their renters sees a marsh rat crawling around the edge of the marsh behind the house. And so then they call the property managers and say, we got a rat infestation, come take care of it. And then they come out and illegally put this bait down. That's what they're saying. And we have no way of knowing if that's true or not.
No, so I mean, so obviously, you know, the easiest way to measure the effectiveness of the voluntary effort, you know, at least on the pest control side. So if you assume most of this is being done by pest control companies, which is probably the case, you know, I'm sure there are some illegal use by, you know, property management companies, you know, that sort of thing. But you know, it's hard to say, you know, how extensive that is. So what we asked for and what they actually promised was that they would inspect the application records of every company working out here. And they would look at volumes and usage of these products going back as far as they could. You know, companies are required to keep application records for these pesticides for 2 years. So if initially Clemson said, okay, we're going to come in, we're going to look at the records going back, you know, historically, and we're going to look at them over time, and we're going to tell you what that change is, right? Did it, you know, 80% fewer SGAs in the environment, you know, or whatever it might have been. And instead of doing that, what they did was they did a voluntary online anonymous survey of pest control companies. And they determined, I think there were 26 companies that are licensed and actively doing structural pest control on Kiowa. So that's the 26. So they started with they actually started with our business license list, which had 70-something companies on it. And then they whittled it down to somewhere around 37, and then only 26 of those did the survey. So anyway, so the information they provided is there were 26 companies, about half of them were using SGAs a year ago, and only one is using SGAs now. But again, it's hard to put a whole lot of faith in those numbers because you've got no way to corroborate them. I mean, it's an anonymous survey, and there's no data behind it. So obviously, if you don't have that sort of data, the only other way to get at this is you monitor it in the environment. And so that's why we've been picking up raccoons and possums and screech owls and Cooper's hawks since February. And so
You send them off somewhere to get the...
we do. We take the livers here, and then we ship the livers to Michigan State, to the vet lab there. Go Spartans. And then they send they run first and second gen. They test for first and second generation anticoagulants.
So when our last bobcat dies, what then becomes the issue with this rat poison? Is it another? I mean,
Other predators are, it's not just the bobcat.
Well, yeah, it's
No,
the
dead
rat
rat
is
Yeah, so just
and scavengers.
so since February, we've picked up 19 animals: raccoons, possums, bobcats, a Cooper's hawk, and a screech owl. All but one of those have been exposed to these products. So, and some of them at obviously very, very high levels.
So in the face of this kind of, I guess this is just amazing to me, that in the face of that, what seems to be overwhelming data, why does Clemson, is it just the power?
It's complicated.
Go into your back right pocket and pull out your wallet.
Right.
Take a look inside and you will see the answer.
Yeah, I mean, the regulation of these pesticides is a little bit complicated because they're federally regulated, and so the federal government puts restrictions on their use, and then states, for the most part, well, they have to follow the federal guidelines, and sometimes they put additional restrictions, but not typically. So it's pretty much, the EPA does a review of every pesticide every so often. They put certain restrictions or they ban certain pesticides. I think SGAs are one, at least what I've heard, kind of on the street, is that it's a group of products that EPA is going to be reviewing again, and they may end up disappearing at some point in time. But that's not a quick process.
We've met with Senator Campson, and I personally think that he's very committed. I think he was very interested. I think he's very supportive, and very willing to do everything he can. But he was also quite candid, quite honest. He talked about he would depending upon how this thing progresses, bring legislation to the floor. But he acknowledged it won't pass because of the power of the lobbyists, even in Columbia. They're a strong group. So if that's with legislators, you can imagine what they have with as funding sources for goodness knows what with the regulators at Clemson. So it's a.
Is it all possible to repopulate the bobcat population?
Yeah, you know, that's a question that's come up a number of times. You know, obviously we'd prefer to deal with the problem and let the population naturally recover. You know, obviously, you know, Kiowa bobcats are unique. You know, they've you know, adapted over 30, 40 years, you know, to the slow development on Kiowa and know how to survive and live and hunt here. And so, you know, even if you did go grab bobcats somewhere else and bring them here, you would have limited success probably with them staying. And even if they stayed, they'd probably struggle to kind of fit in. You know, I think that, you know, there's still hope. You know, what's hurt us is that obviously, you know, we've had a lot of bobcats die, and we've had a lot of females die, you know, and we've seen very little, well, we had no known reproduction, no kittens born last year, which is the first time since we started putting collars on bobcats that we haven't found at least one den with kittens. And so obviously if adults are dying and young aren't being born, it's a recipe for disaster. So, you know, despite us not really, you know, I think we've made pretty significant strides at reducing the amount of these products in the environment. They're still out there, and they probably always will be. I think there are fewer. I mean, there certainly are fewer out there than there were a year ago. And so I'm hopeful that this year, you know, we're going to catch a few bobcats. We'll see some successful reproduction, and then hopefully we'll start to at least see the population stabilize. And, you know, if we keep at it, you know, hopefully naturally come back.
Do we actively go to these pest control companies that have not joined the thing to get them to do it? I mean, are we doing that?
Yeah, so we are about to start doing that. So, you know, for the most part, it's been, you know, emails to these companies, you know, asking them to sign up. You know, if they sign up, we list them on our website. The Conservancy also lists the companies that have signed up, and they also list the companies that have not signed up. So if you go to their site, you can actually see the companies that have not taken the pledge. We are in the process of setting up, I don't want to call it a task force. I hear that word too much. But anyway, a little working group to basically do just that, which is to reach out directly via phone calls. You know, it'd probably be in person if not for the pandemic, you know, and go visit or call, you know, the companies that haven't signed up, the property management companies that haven't signed up, the rental agencies that haven't signed up, and try to get, you know, reach out to them in a more personal manner to kind of hopefully get them on board. And so that should be underway here soon.
Jim, is that working group, is that part of Jim Gilliam, the Conservancy, or is that different?
It's
Is that the group that he started?
So effectively, Jim Gilliam's group, under the auspices of the Conservancy, dissolved once they produced their kind of white paper on the subject. And so the new group is under the, you know, is technically under the Environmental Committee or part of us. It's still headed by Jim and has a lot of the same members, but it's technically our working group. Okay, so then just a couple more quick things, kind of next steps. You know, we talked about you know, the involvement of Senator Campson, and he had asked that we basically send him a letter, you know, telling him how we thought things were going, and that he would, you know, potentially take some action, or he would at least forward that letter on to DPR with his comments. And so we're in the process of working on that letter now. Obviously, we're going to continue to do our GPS work. Obviously, if, you know, if we weren't doing this long-term research, if we didn't have animals with GPS collars on, then we would have never known this was going on. I mean, we would have known that bobcats were dying, you know, that they were declining and that deer were going up, but we would have never gotten to these animals in time to get them tested to figure out what the problem was. So obviously, continuing to monitor that, look at mortality rates is critical to understanding this. Obviously, we're going to continue to pick up things that get hit by cars other than bobcats, or things that die anywhere on Kiowa, and continue to test those. We're, you know, another thing, and it was one of the objectives of the DPR task force, was additional research on this topic. We are pretty far along in discussions with a couple of professors at Clemson on a 4-year PhD project that would look at a variety of things, including, bobcats, SGAs, rodents, population distribution of rodents. It would provide data to answer a lot of the questions. It would be great data long-term for other communities on this topic. And so we've got a proposal now, we've got a tentative budget, and so they're trying to get funding for that project. And just, the full-scale version of this project, the budget is about $950,000. So it's a very large-scale, very intensive project. So we'll see if funding comes through, and it may be that the town is asked, or is asked to provide direct funding as well. And obviously, if that happens, that's something that I'll bring up during the budget process, because I should have an answer on that in the next couple of weeks. And then the last thing, obviously, we're going to continue our education and outreach efforts, the Bobcat Guardian program.
950,000 is over 5 years?
It's 4 years.
Okay.
It's 3 years of field work and then an additional year of writing and data analysis for the student. It could run into 5 years before they finish up everything. But it's basically 3 years of field work.
But you can go ahead and write the check for the full $1 million.
Well, that's what I wanted to be clear, even for public hearing, that even if it's
Sure.
950,000, if the town's direct, it is split over 4 or 5 years, so it's not
Correct.
a one-time, write a check for 500,000.
Correct. Yes. All right. I don't remember so I think what do we have next? Was Conservancy on the agenda next?
Yeah, Conservancy.
Well, I think we've kind of already covered that one. And then next was Beach Management Plan?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I just wanted to kind of tell, and some of you in here certainly know this, talk a little bit about the beach, the town's responsibility for managing it, and the requirement for this beach management plan. So the state's Beachfront Management Act requires that all coastal municipalities have a beach management plan in place. You have to review it every 5 years, but you don't have to actually make changes, and you don't have to notify DHEC. But every 10 years, you've got to do a complete revision, and it has to be approved by DHEC. There are 10 required criteria. The plan must be in place to receive state and federal funding for beach renourishment projects. So unfortunately, Kiawah is not eligible for that funding because we don't have enough public access to our beach. So we only get credit for the county park, which basically gives us credit because of the size of the park for about a mile of our beach, and the rest of it is considered private. So we're not eligible for funding, but we still obviously are required to have this document in place. So the first beach management plan was completed in 1992, and we did full updates in 2006, 2012, and 2020. So the 2020 plan was approved by council this past year, and it's got to go through the formal DHEC approval process, and then we'll get a letter saying it's been accepted, and we'll be done for another 5 years until we do our 5-year review.
Jim, the funding we received for the erosion that took place up at the ocean course, a while ago, I'm not following, how did that sneak in there? What did we do?
The state funding, I think he's talking about.
So
Is that because of the
2006 or?
the 2000, so I guess maybe it would be good just to quickly touch on the beach projects we've done and how they were funded. So, in general, Kiawah's beach is incredibly healthy. We've got one of the healthiest beaches in the state, and that is mainly because we are down drift or down current of the biggest inlet in the state of South Carolina in terms of sand volume. So the Stono Inlet, which is between us and Folly, has millions of cubic yards of sand. And periodically that sand breaks off of the ebb delta, if you will, of that inlet and washes onto the east end of Kiowa, and then basically naturally comes down the beach and renourishes our beach. So we get these big influxes of sand periodically, and it keeps our beach incredibly healthy. So the only issues that we've had are when that shoal bypassing process where the sand attaches and then renourishes has gotten messed up a little bit. And that's happened twice. The first project we did was in 2006. And basically what happened is we had a big shoal attach, but before it attached on one side, well, basically as a shoal attaches, a big shoal comes on the shore, you get erosion on either side of that shoal just due to the wave action. And so what happened in leading up to the 2006 project was the shoal attached on one side and then basically wrapped around, but couldn't attach on this side because of a tidal creek. And that tidal creek was eroding into the Ocean Course Golf Course. And so we did a very large project then. We moved 550,000 cubic yards of sand. And that project was $3.6 million. And the town funded, let's see. So we got, 500 from Kika, 300 from the resort, and 100,000 from the partners. So yeah, it was 3.6, and so we paid 2.7.
Yeah, it sounds like that. Yeah.
So it was all privately funded, right? Whereas like when Folly Beach renourishes, they're getting federal funds, and a lot of that's because they can tie their erosion issues to the construction of the jetties. And so basically it's federal funding when they have to do a renourishment project almost all the time. And for a lot of other beaches too, they're eligible for state and federal monies to renourish. We are not. So we basically have to pay out of pocket for these projects. But fortunately, they don't happen very often. The second project happened in 2015. Much smaller project. We only had it was the same issue basically, a tidal creek eroding near the ocean course, and so that project cost $538,000. We did that one in 2015, and then those are the only two major renourishment projects. The only other thing that we've done in late fall of 2017-18, after a couple of storms. We had some significant erosion of the dunes along most of the Kiowa beachfront. And so we did a sand scraping project that cost around $220,000 to basically take sand directly from the low tide beach and push it up and rebuild the dune.
Through those storms, through the scraping storms, so easy would pay for all of it. We did submit to FEMA. We got reimbursed if it was related to the storm.
Yes.
So we did get reimbursed back from FEMA, the federal and the state gave us some up to 80%, or it may have been because FEMA would do 80% and potentially the state can pick up the difference. So we may have gotten 100% back. I have to go back and look and see how much, but we did get money back on that project.
We did because they were emergency. It was basically emergency berm building after a natural disaster. So it wasn't a beach renourishment project. It was just a sand moving project to get a berm in place because we had structures pretty close to the active beach.
And the 2017 that you mentioned, that we paid for all of that, didn't we?
Well, that was the 2015 project.
15.
We paid for all of that.
Yeah.
The 538.
Yeah.
But then if you add in, because anytime you do a project on the beach and you go through permitting, there's always mitigation involved. So the cost of the 2015 study, the construction was 538, but if you add in the cost of all the mitigation, which included surveys for macroinvertebrates and piping
Right.
plovers, it was about $1 million project.
Right.
Do we have money in our emergency funding that's earmarked for beach renourishment, or is it just all in that one big general pot of, oh my God, something horrible has happened?
So we do have in a capital improvement,
Yeah.
we do, it's not maybe designated to the beach, but we know that that's coming up. So that's
Okay.
one of the bigger, capital projects coming up. So we do save up.
So while it's not earmarked, at least we're cognizant of that?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right, last one is deer.
That, what Jim just described, that can never be understated. I mean, that potential is just enormous. And then that's on the beach side, and then the marsh side, and then the cleanup side. I mean, so as robust as those reserves seem to be, the expense associated with this stuff is just to be staggering.
All right, so last one is just kind of an update on the deer program. And so I've just got a few kind of general slides on deer and what we're seeing, and then, what we plan to do. So obviously, you all live out here. We got plenty of deer out here, a lot more than we had before. Deer are a keystone species. They can basically impact their environment, and they do that mainly by what they eat. So obviously they can, eat landscape shrubbery, but they can also eat, every little tree sapling in the woods and basically change, the composition of the forest. Here at Kiowa, they're an iconic species. People like to see them, but they also have some public safety risk. We hit them with our cars. They're certainly involved in the transmission of certain diseases to people, Lyme disease probably being the most well known. As I mentioned when I was talking about bobcats and anticoagulants, our deer numbers started rising in 2017, and since that time they haven't stopped rising. And so, this is obviously directly related to, fewer bobcats eating deer fawns, more deer fawns surviving, and so now we have a lot more deer. And obviously this, more deer has led to more complaints, more car collisions, more requests for us to do something, and so that's kind of where we are now. And so, seeing those numbers go up, we were asked to develop a deer management plan for the island, which was approved by Town Council in April of 2020. So it's a program to harvest deer, to manage Kiowa's deer population.
Jim,
Yes.
quick question. Can you go back to the last slide?
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking at, like the 03 to 05 numbers and kind of seeing the fluctuation. And I know we were talking about, the rise of the deer population of the last probably 4 years or 5 years. It could potentially be due to the bobcat decline. But looking at that, is some of that also could be contributable to maybe the loss of habitat for the bobcat due to the island's growth? Because I'm seeing also with the island growing over those years, could that potentially also have some impact in terms of our bobcat population, the loss of habitat, or?
Sure. Yeah.
So it could be a combination of trying to encourage people in their backyards to build kind of like their backyards more into a habitat where they have native plants and things for our wildlife.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But, I think that, and I guess just, so we do spotlight surveys to come up with this data. So we drive the same route every time, the same observers, we count every deer we see, and then there's a formula to figure out basically how far you can see into the woods, and so you use that visibility to basically figure out how large an area you surveyed, and then you come up with a density within that area and you apply that density out to the island. It's the best, easiest technique out there, but it doesn't give you, actual numbers. It's really good at picking up trends in data over time. And so it's gonna miss little trends, or it may, so you're always going to see little fluctuations, but you can be very confident when you see a large fluctuation that it's 100% accurate. And so, while it looks like numbers kind of fluctuated, over the last 12, 13 years, and they probably did, it certainly looks like there's a slight, long-term increase in numbers. But, I can tell you that certainly in the last 3 years, the numbers have definitely substantially increased every year. And so while certainly, we probably have fewer bobcats, even before the issue with SGAs, we probably had fewer bobcats, a few fewer than we did, 15 or 20 years ago when there was less development. But I don't think that anything, you know, development-wise has occurred in the last 3 years that's been significant enough to drive this. So the driver for this is likely primarily the problems with SGAs. That's led to a very quick decrease in bobcat numbers and a very quick increase in deer numbers. So the plan was presented to council in April of 2020. It was approved. It will utilize sharpshooting to harvest deer from the island. We have received our state permit and tags to do that work. Under the state program, work can be conducted from September 15th through March 1st. So this work for this first year will get completed between now and March 1st. All of the meat has to be donated to charity. In our case, we're going to donate it to 180 Place here in Charleston. And so that program, as I said, it'll take place between now and March 1st, but will be done during the month of February. And this year, for the first year of the program, we've got 100 tags to utilize. And so likely this is something that we will have to do for several more years. Hopefully it's not something we have to do forever, like a lot of communities. Obviously the hope would be that we could get deer numbers back to, you know, where they were historically, which would be in the 50 to 70 deer per square mile range. And that hopefully bobcats would recover and then they could keep them there like they have historically. But I think we can expect that we'll need to do this for at least a couple of years. And my guess is that next year we'll probably need to remove more than 100. I think 100 is a good start for the first year of the program, but next year it may be more like 200, or maybe even more, but we'll see. So obviously we'll continue to do our spotlight surveys. So obviously once these 100 are removed, we'll have our surveys from next fall to see what the numbers did. Did we bring it down at all? Did we stabilize numbers? And then we'll make the decision on the recommendation for the next year.
You going to be doing this at one location or multiple locations?
It'll be across the island.
Okay.
Yep.
Obviously on different nights?
Yeah.
For example, you're not going to send out 3 sharpshooters on one night at 3 different locations?
Well, so Aaron and I will be doing, it's all done by town staff. You know, and so Aaron and I will be jointly working together to do this. I'm guessing it'll take us 5 to 7 days. And so again, throughout the island, we'll try to spread the harvest out as much as we can. So we remove a few from all sections of the island. But in particular, we're going to focus on areas where we have particularly high levels of deer vehicle collisions. Currently as well as historically, and areas where, you know, from our surveys we know there are more deer than others. So, you know, we're going to try to hit the hot spots, because 100 deer on, you know, as big as this island is, really isn't that many deer in the grand scheme of things.
Harvest that many in 5 to 7 days, that's a bunch every night.
It is.
Can you do that? Are you going to have additional manpower to clean?
No.
I assume you're going to make these fields.
Yeah, so, you know, I talked with the former council about kind of my experience in this issue, but, you know, I've been doing this type of work, deer removal from suburban communities, for 21 years, you know, independent of my work here at the town, for a number of communities in the state. And so got a good idea, you know, I know how these programs work. I know how to make them effective and safe and efficient. And, you know, from prior experience, I think we can, 5 to 7 days is a very realistic timeline.
Wow.
Jim, you were gonna bring the dead carcasses to the next place, right?
Yeah,
Is
so,
that in Somerville?
No.
well, the processor is.
Yeah.
So yeah, so every night after the deer are harvested, they're loaded up and they'll be taken to the processor.
That's
Oh.
right, for the mayor's benefit, I was like, that's a
Yeah,
lot.
thank you. I wondered.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't
we're
have to
gonna-
deal with that part.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know.
I've just got to transport them
We're
to
not out in the garage.
the processor,
That's true.
and then he
Or hanging
he
from the
takes it
raft
from
or something
there.
like that. Yeah.
Nope.
No,
Nope,
that's
and
also the man that we're
You know,
not.
that's one reason why we do this work when it's nice and cold out, because obviously you don't have to worry about keeping the meat, you know, in some sort of refrigerated storage. So we'll pick a couple of cold nights, and you know, like I said, you know, all of it's going to go to 180 place, and just kind of to give you a guesstimate of how much meat that's going to be. 100 deer probably is going to average 30 pounds per deer of ground meat delivered. So you're looking at what, 3,000 pounds of meat, which you know, is probably, I think they typically say, right, that, you know, for these shelters that provide food like this, that a quarter pound of meat is a meal. So if you look at it that way, this is 12,000, you know, meals provided to those less fortunate, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it's great. I hate it.
Jim, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Things you learn.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. I spent a lot of time preparing for this.
I just have some comments. We're really right on time. I guess, first of all, thank you all for attending this. As I outlined yesterday, I really think these are important, and I think we've accomplished a lot that we wanted to do. And thank you, Petra, for all your support in making this so comfortable for all of us. These are some things that we did, that I thought. We really identified those priorities that are critical for 2021. So I think we went through the list fairly exhaustively, and I think we identified those. I think clearly we discussed the implications and the conditions necessary to accomplish. So I think we had a pretty robust discussion about all of that. Probably more, we need to continue to outline a timetable of all of those and how they fit into a work plan for 2021. But the timetable will be important. We know now, and we've been reinforced these key dates for the financial plan. So we're working off of the 2021 budget for a number of items, but we know now that February 26th, the key dates for for Stephanie to get the budget, and then for March 22nd, it'll come back to council. So, you know, the 21-22 financial plan, that's looming out there. That's not that far away. I think we have a good handle now in terms of responsibilities and assignments, and, you know, again, thank all of the council and the staff for putting that all together. So I think we see how that, and we've emphasized the importance of communicating. So thank you, Wendy, for watching, listening, and Kathy. But I think we have to continue to focus on communication. You know, there's a lot of stuff that was covered. There's a lot of information that clearly is important to the community at large. So we just have to continue to focus on that. The vehicles that we're going to use, how we're going to do it, when we're going to do it, the frequency that we're going to do it. And I guess maybe the last kind of rhetorical question to ask, how do we as a council, Stephanie and her staff, what do we envision in terms of routine reporting? So, you know, we've spent 8 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, you know, these past 2 days in terms of going over this. We have monthly council meetings, you know, take a segment of the council meeting per se, embed this into council reports. So, I mean, I think that's something that we need to think about in terms of what we want to do, the frequency within which we want to do that. We don't want council meetings to be, you know, hours on end. That isn't the right answer. But I think we have to think in terms of routine reporting on a lot of these things, updates, status reports, you know, whatever the situation may be. And maybe, Stephanie, that's just some thoughts that, you know, you and I can talk about and think about, and you know, work with everybody in terms of, you know, we do have a mechanism, you know, council meetings, but I think we want to keep this stuff out there. We want to keep it, you know, mind's eye. We want to be able to see it and visualize it, and be able to be sharing it with Stephanie and just communicating. So those are just some of the thoughts, comments that I have. clearly there's some really exciting stuff. I think hopefully we can solve some problems for the community, whether it's this waste removal, the parkway. I think this adaptive management plan. I think there's really some interesting stuff that's out there. So, any comments to share, Stephanie? Do you have anything?
I'll go last if they want to.
Dan, anything to add?
Well, I would certainly echo what you've said. I think what I like about a lot of what was said today, we have really two jobs, always as the council. Today's business, this year's business, which we're very good at, we're focused on. The other job, which is harder to do, but more important in many ways, is thinking out over a decade, the next 10 years. What are we doing now that's going to make a difference then? A lot of these programs, whether it's the work, if you think about nature, the work that's going on with the university and the study of the marshes and the study of the groundwater, that's beginning to build a database which will help us for decades keep this island protected. I think a number of the programs we've talked about today are good because they cross over the annual boundary and get us out thinking over 10 years. And I think the last administration, I think Craig was good about that.
Yes.
In helping us think that way. And the more we can do that, and I think our two new members of council, you've had experience in council before, but I'm very pleased how quickly they've been able to pick up that sense of responsibility and really gotten into it. And both of you guys have done a great job in studying what it's going to take to get your responsibilities done, which is a great way to start. Mary and I, we've done it for a couple of years. It's been interesting and fun. You've got some prior experience, which helps us all a lot. You're not having to learn how it works. The circumstances have changed a little bit, but some of the problems are problems we faced with 5 years ago. So it's a good start.
Good start. John?
So for me as a rookie, this was amazingly helpful. When I decided to run, I did it out of this sense of wanting to be involved in what happens to the town. Maybe these last 2 days have helped me realize exactly what I really meant. and there's a lot.
And you're still here.
And I stay. So, but I think the key is I see two parts. Much like Dan, there's the kind of the tactical things that we need to be sure we're doing. Some are parts of these more long-term projects, but we need to make sure that we actually do something and not just continue to talk about things. But then we need to always do those with the longer view, so that you don't end up having to redo something that you hadn't considered the longer view. And so, I was pretty excited. I mean, don't misunderstand this, but I even told my wife last night how exciting the accounting discussion was. So, I guess my point is it was all very beneficial to me. So.
Good.
Well, I echo all both of those sentiments, and the only thing that comes to my mind is I felt like we planted a tree today, and in 30 years, hopefully, that is going to be the right tree, and it's going to provide what this town needs. And I know that other councils have done similar things and had longer range visions, but I feel like we have recognized the fact that this town is fundamentally going to change on our watch, and we have got to take a bigger step in terms of planting the right tree today.
Excellent point. I do feel that. There's something about, maybe it's just the sales or the people, but I do think over these next couple of years. Yep. Marianne?
Well, I really enjoyed these 2 days. I think that just shows, I know that when I was first elected, I told the mayor, I really felt there was a lot going on in Kiowa and that our future was going to continue to build. The discussions today and yesterday have reflected a lot of that. I think it's important for us to keep up on it. It's like once John talked about that report that was done, having the report is good, but if there's no follow-up, it's worthless. Right. And John, I think that you have some ideas based on your experiences, very valuable. all of us, and you've seen a longer picture than some of us. So, looking forward to continue to work on it. One thing I do think, and this is kind of a minor issue, is I think it's important to have these meetings available to the public, even when we have Zoom meetings or a meeting like this. There are people that are interested in the live streaming, and just because we say, you know, you can come to the meeting if you have your mask and everything, some people are not comfortable with that yet. So I would encourage us to continue to have these live feeds available. That's it, thank you.
Good, thank you. Okay, Stephanie, any?
No, I just want to thank you all. I think this was a great 2 days. I'll work with the mayor. We have, I think he said, kind of like a priority list of stuff, and I've been able to go on a lot of things, and I'll add on that. And I'll talk with the mayor in a way to keep you all updated in terms of the progress of everything that is on this sheet, or if there's things on there that we need to add that you all don't see. I use that tool for staff because, as you guys know, you set the policy and we carry out the operations side of things. And so this is helpful when we're doing evaluations or just understanding that, you know, these are the goals of town council. You guys are the direct line of communication to the community, to the residents, so you're hearing from them. And then you're able to, for the most part, come to us with those issues or concerns, or add it as a long-term project. So you're our eyes and ears a lot to what the community is discussing. I hear things as well, but of course, you guys are the boots on the ground, and you hear more. So it's very helpful. We encourage ideas and communications. I know with Stephanie, she does town notes, so we're always looking for articles or ideas. Wasn't on the agenda per se, but just keep in mind that if you guys know if you have a great article, you may say, hey, this might be something that's helpful for the community. Please let me know, or get with Stephanie. We put out right now, we're still doing four town notes, one a quarter. So we're always looking for ideas to go into that. One last thing, and I will talk with the mayor about this, and I know we have to act on it, and I'm sorry every time we have a council meeting, I think about it prior to the council meeting, but I forget to bring it up. During our emergency order, we had in there that any fines that are written goes to court, found guilty, that we were going to donate that money. We have probably, last I checked about 2 months ago, we were at 5,000. We might be at 6,000 now, but the idea before we started this was because of a lot of restaurants were closed and employees were out of work, and we thought, okay, we want to donate this, pick some organization, charity that is helping hospitality industry. Well, I've gone through before a couple of months ago, and a lot of these different organizations are no longer in existence, but we still have this commitment. So I'll look, there could be some other type of organization. I'll kind of put together maybe a list for you all to think about, but that was a commitment that we made. It was part of the emergency ordinance, and we probably have, I'll have to check with Sherry, but we might be up to 6,000 or so, but that is a commitment that I think, and I would like for us to carry out.
Sure.
That's all I have to report, Mayor. I don't know, Dorota?
Dorota, anything? John, anything else? I love your perspective beyond the gates. Was that you?
That was me.
Nice. Well done.
I
Well
don't know if
done.
you want.
Can I just make one other comment?
Oh, yeah.
I think I don't want to leave this public forum without saying this. One of the things that has impressed me in this last 2 days is we have an amazingly well qualified staff.
Oh.
Every person that spoke is an expert.
Top drawer, yes, they are.
That should not go unmentioned.
Absolutely. Brian, anything else?
I'm good, thank you, Mayor.
Jim?
Yes, sir.
Stephanie? Petra? Bruce? And I agree. Thank you all. You guys are great, and it's fun. This is, like I said, this is the elixir that makes it all worthwhile to get things accomplished. So, good. Be safe.
And
Motion to adjourn. All in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you.
And just as a reminder, Ways and Means, I've been working with